There You will stay here. I saw call Congress to order. If you could take your seats, delegates, please. Many thanks again to Esme Bridie, who's been playing for us again this afternoon. Thank you, Esme. Congress, you'll all be aware of the issues in Birmingham City Council and the potential bankruptcy of Europe's largest local authority. Just to let people know who've got contacts there, there'll be a rally at 5 p.m. tonight in Birmingham, organised by Unison, Unite and GMB. And they're highlighting standing up for public services. So do pass that on. If you need any more information about what the rally, where the rally is and all other details, for further information, can you contact the unions directly? And Congress, we've got a bit of good news to share. This morning, shut up. Some good news to share. This morning, we've heard that community members at Glen Dimplex in Prescott have won an improved pay offer after 5.5 weeks of industrial action. They were originally offered just £10.61 an hour, but 170 members have secured pay above the living wage and lump sum payments between £1,100 and £1,800. And Congress, can we give Mark Thomas and Gavin Miller from Community, sat here in the front row, a round of applause, please? Sorry, I had to do this. Thank you, Congress, for your cooperation this morning, and I'm hoping this afternoon we're able to catch up further on some of the business lost yesterday, and I'll let Congress know where we're fitting things in when we're able to. So, without further ado, we return to section 4 of the General Council report, Winning a Better Future for Working People, from page 46. I call paragraph 4.8. And very important debate for the future, Composite 13, Artificial Intelligence in the Workplace. The General Council support the composite motion to be moved by CW, seconded by Musicians Union.
President, Congress, Karen Rose from the Communication Workers Union to move Composite 13. Congress, there are so many important issues being discussed at this conference. But the unregulated increase in the use of technology and artificial intelligence in our workplaces is one of the most significant threats we have faced currently. Artificial intelligence is everywhere, from Netflix recommendations to human resources management, including the hiring, firing and surveillance of workers. Our members in the CWU are already experiencing the damaging and dehumanising impacts of AI systems, including work intensification, discrimination, and the invasion of privacy. In Royal Mail, delivery workers must now carry digital devices on their rounds, collecting data on their productivity and pace of work. The data from these devices has been used to pit workers against each other, and we have seen some of our members being questioned and disciplined by management for stopping to rest or answer a customer's question. Also in the delivery sector, we've seen Amazon drivers reporting that they're being forced to drive into dangerous driving to hit unachievable delivery targets set by the company's app. In BT contact centres, our workers have AI-powered apps to guide customer conversations and to meet stringent goals for call handling. BT's chief executive also told investors earlier this year that he expects to replace AI expects AI to replace 10,000 jobs in the business by the end of this decade. That's 10,000 jobs just from one single employer wiped out by artificial intelligence in just a few years. In the tech sector, workers are also monitored by surveillance systems, including mouse tracking and screen recording to scrutinise every detail of their behaviour and performance. Employers across our economy are increasingly reliant on advanced technologies to make managerial decisions with devastating results where data is incorrect or biased. When workers are told the computer says no, they don't have any clear route for appeal, there's no automatic right to human review, and we welcome the TUC's call to change this. Earlier this year, Just Eat couriers were instantly deactivated from the company's app for minor infractions. No evidence of a human review of the decision. Uber drivers lost their jobs when the company's automated face scanning software couldn't accurately recognise people with darker skin. And Teleperformance came under fire for fitting an AI-based webcam scanning system into workers' homes. Trade unions have been held back by the government's refusal to bring in much-needed regulation, and we must now urgently pursue legislation against the unregulated use of AI in the workplace, prioritising workers' rights, well-being and job security. This includes establishing guidelines to ensure humans are an integral part of the decision-making processes, protecting workers from exploitative practices, promoting transparency and accountability in AI systems, and ensuring retraining and redeployment opportunities are in place. It was great earlier this month to see the launch of the TUC's AI task force, which brings together unions along with the leading experts, lawyers and politicians to draft and promote new legislation to safeguard workers' rights and ensure AI benefits all. The importance of this work cannot be underestimated. That's why we're calling on Congress to agree to invest in a major research project which identifies the use and risks of new technology, including tracking and AI in workplaces across multiple sectors. We also want the TUC's campaign against unscrupulous use of technology in the workplace to be a key initiative for 2024. Most importantly, the TUC and trade unions need to be working with the Labour Party and the government to ensure that ironclad legal right to consult trade unions on the introduction of new technologies in the workplace is enshrined in law. And that needs to be part of the New Deal for Workers. Congress, we're not opposed to the use of new innovative technologies. We know they can make life better for us all, but we want trade unions and workers to be at the heart of how we approach the rapidly changing world of work. Please support the motion.
Thank you, Karen. And while the Musicians' Union are coming up to second, can NUJ, Aegis, USDOR, Community and AUE come to the front supporting this composite? And I will call another couple of people in the debate if we have time. MU.
Thank you. President Congress, I'm Robert Scott, Musicians' Union, and I'm seconding on Conference Composite 13. Rock and roll is here to stay. Somebody made that observation about 70 years ago, and I'd make the same prediction about artificial intelligence. Why do I say that? Because you can't uninvent new technology. A new technology like this will move forward very rapidly. And of course, it will bring huge benefits to a lot of people. However, it has got a big downside. It's been launched without really a very full understanding of what it can do, and there is virtually no legislation around it. So the first question is, well, what actually is it? Well, it's a piece of software that can generate new content such as text, images, audio, and of course, music. And it does that using something called an algorithmic computer program. And these things learn patterns to generate new patterns, or put it another way, it uses existing music to create new music. So an example might be that you take somebody like Mozart, Frank Sinatra, David Bowie, Jimi Hendrix, and you put their material into it, and it will produce new songs for you. And that's called training the AI program to generate new music using existing work. The problem there is what I've just described is all under copyright, and the owners of that copyright have not been asked. Now, the government has proposed an exception to existing copyright law that allows AI corporations to use all British recorded music to train the software. This might sound familiar. Do you remember buccaneering Britain with its offshore economy, attracting new investment by a low taxation, deregulated economy? Well, here we go. We've got a new circus, but the same old clowns. So here we go, no permission needed and no payment to the musicians. So existing material could be used for non-commercial purposes or to create new records for sale. But the problem is, all over the world, the legislation is not clear on this. What we're asking you for today is copyright protection for existing work used to train AI programs, rights for human creators to refuse to let their work to be used for AI and to be paid for it if it is, AI-generated work to be clearly labelled as such, so there's no confusion with the public, and record keeping to protect existing work. Please support us, and we will support you when it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. I've got Aegis and then NUJ, Usdaw Community and AUE.
Thank you. President, Congress, Fiona Steele, Aegis the Union, supporting Composite 13. This composite covers the variety of challenges in a range of sectors that the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence poses to us all. As a trade union representing workers in the financial services sector, we recognise that AI has the potential to significantly reshape our industry, impacting both employers and employees, and we are committed to ensuring that our members are well informed and adequately prepared for the challenges and opportunities presented by AI. AI has already started to revolutionise various aspects of the jobs in our sectors. This includes decision-making and risk assessment, customer service, fraud detection, investment management and data analytics. While these advancements offer great potential for increased efficiency, they also present a range of challenges that must be addressed to safeguard the interests of workers and consumers alike. As the composite states, the predictions around job displacement are frightening, with an estimated 75% of customer service roles being lost as a direct result of AI. Whilst as unions we strongly advocate for proactive measures to protect jobs and ensure that employees are equipped with the necessary skills to adapt to the evolving nature of their roles, we have still to see firm action plans from the government and employers to tackle the transition. We urgently need to see both parties investing in retraining and upskilling programmes to ensure that everyone benefits from AI and that it improves inequality in the workplace rather than exacerbates it. Too many employers see it as a cost-cutting tool rather than an opportunity for workers to develop themselves into new and hopefully more fulfilling roles. We're also working with employers to emphasise the importance of ethical AI so that the technology is developed and deployed in an ethical manner within the financial sector. This includes addressing concerns around bias, transparency and accountability in the algorithms and decision-making processes to safeguard against discriminatory practices and to protect the rights and privacy of workers. It requires strong governance frameworks to oversee the implementation of AI, frameworks which prioritise workers' rights, which need to be developed collaboratively with employers, industry bodies and policymakers. We welcome the launch of the TUC task force on AI, and we need a fair transition to these new technologies so that workers share the rewards and benefits of the opportunity it brings. Congress, please support this composite. Thank you.
Calling the National Union of Journalists.
Steve Bird, National Union of Journalists, speaking in support of Composite 13. Congress President, the exceptionally rapid development of AI is a tidal wave coming towards us. There's no doubt about that. It's going to affect everybody in this room and obviously far beyond. We're already starting to see the effects of that. Even the likes of Bill Gates have compared it to the invention of the PC, the internet, the mobile phone, the microprocessor. That's the scale that we're talking about. We need to remind ourselves, however, that the people driving this are those with exceptionally deep pockets. They are the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts. Occasionally they are rogue states developing spyware. The dangers of this are already being articulated, not just by the likes of us, but actually by some of the AI pioneers themselves. The development is far outstripping the supervision of it, the scrutiny of it, the legislation. And this is something obviously at the heart of our motion. The race is on. They want to make as much money out of this as possible. And at the moment, there are very few controls. In the UK, we know this government is not a big fan of any kind of legislation. They're already planning to dump human rights laws. They're not fans of health and safety legislation. And the few rules that we have are important in our fight to defend our rights as employees in the face of what is likely to happen. What are the dangers? What we're talking about is, at the heart of everything, is data. And when we say data, it sounds a bit dry, but this is everything we do. Our words, our music, we've already heard from Musicians Union and from Equity about this, but also every single thing that is produced is data that is going to be fed back to us via algorithms. Whether we pay for it or not is open to question. That's one of the dangers. How will we know in this new world? How will we know what's fake and what is real? We need to have indicators. We need to have legislation which tells us which is, there is a world coming in which a newsreader could be physically duplicated. Their voice could be duplicated as well as the content. We need to have safeguards around that. We need to have safeguards around the bias that's built into the algorithms, things that we don't know. They're in the black boxes that are going to be rolled out and employers are going to be using. We need to have safeguards to make sure that because the software is just seeing white faces, it just doesn't give us white faces. That when recruitment software is rolled out, it doesn't just pick able-bodied recruits because it doesn't know any better. That is one of the dangers of the bias of the system. It's not just a social problem. It can also intensify our workload. We have already heard about the case of the robo-firing. 6 taxi drivers fired by a machine. No humans were involved in that. It took them 2 years to go to court and fight. They won this year after a two-year fight to prove that they had not committed fraud. The company refused to give access to the data. This is the prospect of management by machine. Oh, is it? Sorry, is that in the end? Okay. All right.
If you could wind up.
This subject. I really appreciate all your time, and please do vote for the motion.
The next speaker is from Usdaw.
President, Congress, Jane Jones, Usdaw, supporting the composite on artificial intelligence in the workplace. This composite raises a number of critical issues for our union members. The combination of the rapid development in artificial intelligence, as well as the increasing use of automated decision-making processes by employers, are fundamentally changing the world of work as we know it. However, in light of the ever-growing use of these technologies, the protections offered to workers are increasingly being left behind. To truly safeguard our members from the risks of the tech revolution, we need to deliver a proper legal framework, a legal framework that focuses on the protection of workers' rights, that gives workers a voice when new technologies are being introduced, and delivers specific provisions on equality issues, providing real safeguards against discrimination. Whilst the world of modern technology generate AI and automated decision-making processes may seem complex, we should not forget for the simple cause of this composite. Cause to ensure that unions have the right to protect our members. As part of this, we need a greater focus on skills and development. An estimated 9 in 10 employees in the UK will need to retrain by 2030. This means that retraining is essential when it comes to preparing for work for the future. Yet the government refuses to recognise the urgency of the situation. In 2021, they scrapped the Union Learning Fund in England, and despite widespread criticism, they've continually failed to address huge flaws in the apprenticeship levy. This approach cannot continue. We need urgent fundamental reform of the apprenticeship levy. We need the reinstatement of the Union Learning Fund across England. And we need proper recognition of the vital role that trade unions play, especially union learning reps, in supporting workers to retrain and develop new skills. Worryingly, many of the roles with the lowest training rates are both lower paid and insecure jobs. For technology to benefit working people, it must be accessible to all workers, which means the government and employers need to act now, before it's too late. Congress, please support the composite.
Community delegate.
My name's Dwight Miller from Community Union. First time TUC conference. Thank you. Okay, before I start, you all heard the news about Glenn Dimplex, and if you didn't, well, we'd just like to extend our congratulations to them, especially Branch Secretary Mark Thomas and everyone who was involved in those negotiations. Okay, Congress. One of the biggest events in human history started right here in the UK, and that was the Industrial Revolution. It rapidly transformed almost every part of life in our country and around the world. Electricity, aeroplanes, telephones, antibiotics, and much more. It all became mainstream in a single lifetime. Another revolution is on the way, though. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is already transforming the world of work, poised to radically change economic models and the way businesses are organized. In time, it will transform every industry from education to healthcare, from finance to logistics, private and public sector services and beyond. Ultimately, this technology will shape how our society functions for generations to come. Change is upon us. We can't stop the tide, but we can build a boat. We at Community commend the work that the TUC has already undertaken on AI in the workplace. But the pace of change is fast and we need to do more. We need to be preparing and equipping our members for their introduction of AI in their workplaces. We need to identify the risks and the opportunities of AI across all sectors of our economy. And we need to advocate for AI usage, which enhances people's work and enhances their quality of life. So Congress, our movement also needs to be at the forefront of shaping national policy and positive regulations for AI, ensuring our voices are heard in the corridors of power, that regulations are written which work for us and which don't take our work from us. We don't serve our members by protesting innovation. Our job is to make this change work for our members, to make change work for working people. So Congress, please support this motion. Thank you.
Artists Union England, and while the rain is coming up, can Equity, Prospect and Unite come down here? Be ready to speak after this.
Thank you. Artists Union in England, Lorraine Monk. If you Google AI painting, boy, do you get a list. Best AI painting free. Unlock your creativity with the best AI generator. Create stunning and unique artwork. And this, my favorite, effortlessly. Effortlessly. Why work at something? And our free online tool, One Tap, Instant Art. Instant art. If only art was instant, yeah. AI has been hailed as a technological breakthrough, but global corporations don't care about individuals. Their priority is profit for the shareholders and bonuses for the senior managers. Not for them worries of breaches of individual copyright, threats to jobs and freelance work, and the undermining of original content. It will leave creative workers at risk of exploitation, the bare choice being low wage or unemployment. What price do we put on what is made or produced? What price our human experience making art with everything that makes us human. AI is too little understood, opaque and secretive. UK governmental policy surrounding the development of technologies like AI almost invisible. We believe that AI must afford the original human creators, not just the current right holders, the right to decide whether their creations can be used or not. The original human creators must receive a full, fair share in any remuneration, God, I can't even say it now, should they agree to such a use. And any such right should be unwaivable and remain with the creators. And this is our wording that still stays in the composite. For buyers and audiences, we want them information and labelling must be attached, attributed to all products and all creative work that has been made or constructive. So buyers and audiences know what they're getting. Morris observed in 1884, art is central and necessary to everyday life and to our work, a sign of freedom and happiness. Nothing should be made by labour which is not worth making, or which must be made by labour degrading to the makers. We need to remember that today. We need to act quickly. The restless urge to make profit while destroying everything we believe in isn't stopping. Conference, we need to act. Please support.
Equity.
Thank you, President, for giving us this time to contribute. David John, Equity, the Union for Creative Workers, supporting Composite 13. Congress, a year ago, Equity tabled a motion, AI and performers' rights. And here we are, a year later, with the composite motion. The threat to our members' rights are already in full swing. We've had many members this year, specifically voice actors, reporting incidents where their voices, which are the tools of our trade, have been offered on websites without their permission or without offer of remuneration. It is quite simply theft. Our voices are our voices, and we do not give permission for AI companies to exploit them without our consent, without a contract, and without remuneration. So our motion was passed unanimously. We asked for reform of the Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988, which is urgent and is even more urgent now. Ratification of the Beijing Treaty, implementation of the provisions of the EU Copyright Directive, all that would protect our performers' rights, and none of these things have happened. We did talk about the Intellectual Property Office's proposed data mining exemption, which would have meant basically AI companies could have used any voice or image for commercial use legally without paying us, without paying the original creative worker a penny. So this basically reduces us, arts and cultural workers, to mere inputs in AI development. We argued strongly against this, and successfully, and this data mining exemption has now been withdrawn. So a win there for Equity and everyone else. There is a lot more to do. We're working very hard at the moment to insert AI protection clauses in the agreements we're currently negotiating with BBC, ITV and PACT, which is the Producers Association, incredibly important for us. But the truth is, Congress, it takes a human being to lift our voices by using AI as a tool. So what we need urgently is this legal and ethical framework where AI can be used for the good of us all, but not to weaken workers' rights. Our work is precarious at the best of times. We and the musicians are the original gig economy after all, and we need our legal protection quickly of our voices, our images, and our performances. I just very quickly want to shout out to our sister union, SAG-AFTRA, and the Writers' Union in the States across the pond. They're on strike at the moment, and we're supporting them in their strike because their issues are our issues. Thank you. And their main two issues are lack of residuals from the streaming companies who are making a fortune, and a lack of protection from the unscrupulous use of AI. So they're the two main battlegrounds, and we send our solidarity and we say victory to SAG-AFTRA. Please support the composite. Thank you.
Prospect.
Hi everyone, President, Congress, Toby James, Prospect, he, him. Proud to be supporting this composite. It's time to demand better AI regulation from our government. Automation and artificial intelligence are advancing rapidly, and if we don't act now, our jobs and our livelihoods are at risk. We need strong regulations that protect workers, ensure job security, and prevent exploitation by profit-hungry corporations. That sounded good, didn't it? ChatGPT wrote it. Talk about self-indictment. We ran a survey this year. 58% of workers supported the need for regulation. Only 45% of workers believe they wouldn't be involved in any decisions to introduce AI in their workplace. Prospect members across all sectors are worried, they're unsure. But actually, this is not just about the future. AI is already in our workplaces. It's surveilling us. 22% of workers have had software brought in to monitor them. It's hiring us, it's firing us, it's reading our CVs when we apply for jobs, and it's making decisions. And when it is making these decisions, AI is informed by the data around it, and any biases in this data are replicated, learnt, and drawn upon. In my work, this is an annoyance. I am a data scientist. I work in green energy research, and if there's a bias in our data about electric currents or reactor temperature, it's just something we need to iron out. But think about biases in recruitment data. Think about a statistic that shows that most engineers are white, a statistic that shows that, on average, women earn less than men. These are the realities of our workplaces, and we have been working so hard to change them. And yet, when AI models are determining who to hire, how much to pay them, these are the ideas we're feeding them. So you can imagine the outcomes. Congress, this is not how we build the workplace of the future. Support this composite and demand regulation. Thank you.
Unite.
President, Congress, Tom Murphy, United Union. Speaking in support of the composite. Congress, workers in the print industry have long memories, and we remember the charging horses of the Wapping dispute, where millionaires imposed automation by force. New digitalisation and the rapid rise of AI are undoubtedly more subtle than the brutality of that dispute. But if left unchecked, the impacts on workers' jobs and livelihoods will be no less profound. This debate is not about holding back the tide of progress. It never has been. It's about the terms by which it is introduced and who benefits. Analysts at McKinsey are already forecasting AI could increase corporate profits by a further $4.4 trillion. It should be no surprise to us that this isn't how workers experience it. Take call centres. AI voice analytics is used not only to judge if a sale or a service is successful or the length of the call, but to judge the pitch and tone of a worker's voice at every point of every call, to give workers sentiment ratings. This unheard of level of surveillance is happening from workers' own laptops and devices within their own homes. Congress, yes, we need regulation, and yes, we need safeguards on image rights and intellectual property. But we must also focus on what only our movement can deliver: protection and fair distribution of the benefits of AI at work. That can be won through new digital collective bargaining agreements. That must mean consultation on the introduction of new technology. It must mean protection from surveillance. And it must mean the fair distribution of productivity gains. Finally, Congress, I'll let you in on a secret. Well, it ain't that much of a secret because the previous speaker just said it as well. This speech was written using AI on ChatGPT. If AI can automate Congress delegates, then truly nobody is safe. Congress, please support the composite.
Okay, composite motion 13 is before you, Congress. All those in favour? Put your hands down. All those against? That is carried. Right, moving on to the section 2 of the General Council report on the economy and cost of living crisis, which is from page 18. I call motion 19 on RPI Save the Rate. The General Council support the motion to be moved by GMB, to be seconded by Osdor, and NASUWT will speak as well.
Congress President Gary Smith, GMB General Secretary, moving motion 19. Congress, as we've heard a lot over the past few days, our members are at the forefront of the cost of living crisis. Our members are under constant attack by a Tory government that's out of time, out of ideas, and utterly out of touch. We've heard powerful debates this week, and tomorrow we will leave the conference with a renewed sense of unity and purpose in our fight to make work better. In Congress, we must have, and I believe we do have, responses to the attacks that we face today. But we also must plan for the attacks of tomorrow. Congress, generations of trade unionists that came before us, they understood that it is essential that we have the building blocks and the proper infrastructure around our industrial relations processes. And that's why trade unions fought to establish an inflation rate that was suitable for collective bargaining, an inflation rate that was designed to measure working people's true cost of living. The RPI rate grew out of the Attlee government's determination to right the injustices of the pre-war years. It was our unions which shaped the evolution and the credibility of that rate through the TUC. When RPI was created, we were around the table. But now we must understand that this essential tool is to be removed under the Tory plans. The Tory government didn't even fully consult over its plans to effectively abolish RPI from 2030. And of course, that RPI link has already been taken away from more than 5 million public sector workers. That's had a detrimental impact on pensioners and, in particular, women members of our unions. And now the government's changes will leave millions of private sector workers and pensioners out of pocket too. The reality is, if pay or pensions up rating is switched from RPI to CPI, then a decade later, those payments will have been devalued by 8%. And whilst the arguments might be technical, let's be very clear, the Tories' motivations are political. The Royal Statistical Society has made it clear that the Tory plans will result in us having unsatisfactory measures of inflation as it affects British households. Congress, we are being threatened with a permanent deepening of the cost of living crisis. Congress, this is an utter Tory con. They are trying to make our members poorer, and their hypocrisy is breathtaking. Ministers in business don't hesitate to raise our members' phone charges, their rail fares or their rent by RPI. But at the same time, we are being told that we should hold back on our pay claims. Congress, we must not stand for it. And if we are serious about the future of industrial relations, then we must have a serious, coordinated response to this Tory attack. Congress, it's another Tory attempt to strip away the infrastructure of industrial relations that has been built up by generations of trade unionists. We need to campaign against the Tories, and we need to work with Labour. Otherwise, our unions will reconvene in the years ahead, asking ourselves why we didn't do more. This is why GMB submitted this motion. This is why we're calling for this campaign under the TUC to save the rate, because we must have an inflation rate that is suitable for collective bargaining. This is about fighting for our members' pay and pensions. Let's develop that common agenda. Let's make the defence of the link a key part of the new political economy that will deliver growth, investment and the wages our members deserve. Congress, support the motion, save the rate. Thank you.
Osdor to second.
President, Congress, Dave McCrossan from Usdaw in support and seconding this motion. Congress, with the ongoing cost of living crisis, talk of rising prices has never been far from the news. And as prices continue to rise, it's been trade unions ensuring that wages, pensions and welfare benefits have kept up. However, throughout that whole debate, through all of the wage negotiations that we've conducted, through every negotiation that we've attempted to have with this government, we needed an effective measure of how price rises are rising. And more importantly, how those increases have an impact on our members and their households. Unfortunately, over the past 13 years, the Tories have taken us further and further away from a measure that truly reflects the impacts of price rises on households. Instead, they become increasingly and indefensibly reliant on measures of inflation which gauge the general performance of the economy. The Consumer Price Index measure, which the government now favours, was designed originally to compare one international economy to another. And while it can do that with some degree of accuracy, it does not reflect or offer a full picture of how much our members' wages need to increase in order to protect their living standards. CPI and CPIH are flawed measures for our members. They consistently underestimate the level of inflation and are not truly representative of people's lives. For example, the CPI and CPIH measures include the spending of the top 4% of earners and the spending of those people holidaying from abroad in the UK. As a result, the CPI measures overrepresent changes to the price of luxury goods, such as yacht maintenance costs or stockbroker fees, the kind of things our members have to do every day. But importantly and deliberately, I think, they underestimate the real impact of price increases on essentials, such as food and rent. Congress, all of these issues show why we need to protect and defend the RPI against this government's continued attacks. So please support this important motion. Thank you.
Any SUWT?
John McGill, NSUWT, the Teacher Union. Congress, we're currently living through a cost of living crisis. Soaring rate of inflation has featured prominently in the news since 2021. Significant increase in prices for food and energy in particular has pushed many UK households into poverty and reliance on food banks, as we've mentioned here today on many occasions in the past couple of days. Despite suffering the financial suffering for most workers, Conservative government insists that inflation-busting pay rises are unaffordable. The war in Ukraine has put further pressure on an already increasing energy costs and has reduced the amount of grain available. In January 2023, annual inflation saw food prices increase by 16.4%, gas prices by 132.9%, and electricity prices by 66.7% compared to 12 months previous. It's these supply pressures that are pushing up inflation, not increases to workers' pay. The pay freeze in 2021 for public sector workers, followed by 2022 by the largest real terms pay cut, was totally unjustified and is causing serious financial hardship for many. The government is taking credit for awarding 6.5% for teachers in 2023 and around 5% to 6% for many other public sector workers. But this does not meet the current CPI rate of 6.8%, nor does it match the latest RPI published inflation figure for July, which was 9%. Many public sector workers have endured significant real terms pay cuts since 2010. Many teachers, for example, have endured a 25% real terms pay cut in comparison to an RPI inflation matching pay rise. Claims that public sector pay significantly drive up inflation have been roundly rejected by many economists across the political spectrum. Paul Johnson, for example, Institute of Fiscal Studies, stated, and I quote, "It is not true that giving public sector workers a bit more would increase inflation." The correlation between public sector pay increases and inflation is negligible. Tories' decade of austerity, pay freezes and below-inflation pay awards has led to a devastating impact on the pay of public sector workers. As already mentioned by the previous speakers, there are different measures of inflation and they are designed to do different things. Put simply, CPI and CPIH measure the change in the cost of goods and services that people are buying, while RPI tries to measure the increase in expenditure needed to maintain a minimum standard of living. CPI tracks prices of cheaper alternatives, whereas RPI tries to maintain current living standards. So clearly, most often CPI and CPIH will be lower. In fact, in the last 15 years, it was only 2009 where that actually didn't happen. Pay awards below RPI inflation force people into poverty and food bank use. So the TUC calls for all public and private sector salaries to be restored in real terms to 2010 levels using RPI to protect living standards. 2010, George Osborne...
Time, Delegate, please.
Okay. Basically, enough is enough. All workers deserve a pay rise. Please support the motion.
Thank you, Delegate. Motion 19 on RPI Save the Rate is before you. All those in favour? See your hands down. All those against? That is carried. I call paragraphs 2.5, 2.7 of the General Council report, and now Composite 6, tax raising measures and fair taxation. The General Council support the Composite motion, and it's going to be moved by EIS, seconded by Accord, and CW, PCS, FDA and NEU. Please come down.
President, Congress, Alan Crosby, EIS Vice President and first-time delegate. Colleagues, back in the autumn of 1986, I was heading off to university to begin a degree in English literature. Part of the soundtrack to my life at that time was Billy Bragg's just-released album, Talking to the Taxman About Poetry. How could I have imagined that 37 years I'd find myself talking to the poets of the trade union movement about taxation? But here I am, and very proud I am to be moving this composite. At that time, colleagues, the UK corporation tax was 35%. Just 3 years earlier, in other words, exactly 40 years ago today, corporation tax under Thatcher was 50%, an astonishing fact. But in 3 short years, her government slashed it by 15%, and the downward spiral continued until it got as low as 19% in 2017, where it remained. Until, of course, April of this year, when it was raised by Jeremy Hunt to 25%, reversing the madness of Trussonomics, which had been going to keep it at 19%. Even with that rise to 25%, the UK tax on companies' profits is lower than the G7, the G20, and the OECD. As we've heard in motion after motion, in speech after speech at this conference, 40 years of governments valuing corporate greed over human well-being, profits over people, have been utterly devastating for communities and working people across this broken land and for all the members of our unions. We need a change. We need to find a better way. The STUC commissioned report mentioned in this motion was published in December 2022 and offers a signpost for possible better ways ahead. The report focuses on tax powers that are devolved to the Scottish Parliament and outlines a range of measures which could raise an extra £3.3 billion used to fund a real terms increase in public sector pay, as well as substantial investment in Scotland's public services. They include such things as a series of income tax reforms, increases to land and buildings transactions tax, increasing the additional dwelling supplement, increasing Scottish landfill tax, introducing a wealth tax, replacing council tax with a proportional property tax, the introduction of a land value tax for commercial land, and a carbon emissions land tax. Colleagues, £3.3 billion is a lot of money, but it is small when compared to the dozens, if not hundreds of billions that could be raised and spent on public services at UK level, and then, of course, shared with devolved administrations through resulting increases in the block grant, if similar progressive taxes were brought in at Westminster. Our motion is calling for an investigation and report into what those reforms might be,
and in what can be learned from the tax and spend regimes in Scandinavia and other Western countries. In terms of income inequality, the UK has one of the worst track records. Doing better are Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Belgium, Iceland, Slovenia, Slovakia. The more equal a country is, the better its outcomes in all key indicators such as health, education, criminal justice, and overall happiness and well-being. We need to look at how we can increase our tax to GDP ratio nearer to the average levels in Scandinavia. We need to widen the tax base, increase progressive taxes, close tax loopholes, and then spend much more on public services. The report we're calling for in this motion could look at measures such as the UK's non-structural tax reliefs, which cost the public purse £195 billion in 2021, equalising capital gains with income tax, applying national insurance to unearned income, introducing a financial transactions tax, taxing wealth, cutting inheritance tax loopholes, ending non-dom reliefs. Conference in conclusion, I want to remind you that in January of this year, Oxfam reported that 2/3 of the new post-pandemic surge in wealth went to the top 1%. It is clear that the Tory party is the political wing of that 1%, and we need to get rid of them. But sadly, in many ways, Labour too seems to be missing in action when it comes to exploring radical tax reform. And their current refusal to commit to a wealth tax, if elected, is utterly incomprehensible, given the appalling levels of inequality in this country and given the chorus of different voices clamouring for it. As we know well, and as Billy Bragg sang, there is power in a union, and if our politicians continue to behave like butlers to the billionaires, then it falls to us in the trade union movement to pile on the pressure, demand change and genuine tax justice. This composite motion is a step on that journey. Please support it. Solidarity, colleagues.
Seconded by Accord.
President, Congress, Carol Knowles from Accord to second Composite 6. As we've heard so many times this week, working people are facing unprecedented pressure on their household incomes. Despite today's headlines, most people's wages continue to lag behind inflation. This isn't true for everyone though. CEO pay is up 23% in the last year. Bankers' bonuses are a record high since the financial crash. And dividends are rising 3 times faster than wages. Capital is being rewarded, but labour isn't. In short, wealth is being rewarded, work is not. What's worse, under our flawed system, this expanding wealth is not being taxed fairly. This must now be addressed. And a fair tax system is critical to that too. Who pays tax and how much they contribute are political choices. They have direct impacts for our essential public services and our wider infrastructure. These choices impact directly on fairness and the cost of living of working people too. The money you make from working hard shouldn't be taxed at a higher rate than the money shareholders and property investors generate from their wealth. As our new TUC General Secretary said in his brilliant speech on Monday, we need an economy that rewards work, not wealth. This much inequality is bad for our economy. Fairness and growth go hand in hand, and that's why those with the broadest shoulders should bear the greatest load. So let a start be made by closing tax loopholes, charging VAT on the fees for private schools, a proper windfall tax on the energy companies, and a tax capital gains at the same rate as wages. Congress, we call on the TUC to develop proposals to enable the General Council to lead a debate on reform of our tax system to deliver fairer outcomes for working people, public services and public sector pay. I'm proud to second this composite motion and I ask for your support. Thank you.
CW.
Congress, President, Andy Mercer of the Communication Workers Union rising to support. The cost of living crisis has pushed working class people to the brink, while profits for corporations have literally never been higher, while food prices soar, inflation making wages drop in real terms, and insecure work growing. Bosses and CEOs have been paid large bonuses, and shareholders have received record-breaking dividend paid directly by those struggling workers. With our public services and the NHS in crisis, you think the government would have taken advantage of the windfall profits to help rebuild our national infrastructure after the devastation of austerity and the pandemic, but they haven't. Instead, they've allowed the 1% to extract more wealth than they have ever done before through tax breaks, loopholes, whilst working people are being paid to pay more and more just to get by. The UK's current system of taxation is completely unfair and allows corporations and wealthy individuals to escape their responsibilities. Work is also unfairly taxed compared with assets and other forms of income. A graduate earning £35,000 a year pays almost double the tax on their wages as someone who earns the same income from a property. And at a time when our public services are literally crumbling in front of our eyes, a system of fair taxation could provide the funds that our schools and hospitals so clearly need. The TUC's own research showed that a modest wealth tax on the wealthiest 1% could raise between 70 and 130 billion for the Treasury. It's also shown that equalising capital gains taxation with income would raise roughly 10 billion. It's now more important than ever that the UK taxation system does not place an unfair burden on working people while the rich get away with hoarding their wealth. How can it be right that there are millions of people struggling and live month to month while the global giant Amazon paid nothing in corporation tax in 2021? Now, trade unions must be at the front of this discussion. This has been made clear by the Labour Party, who recently said that they would not introduce a wealth tax. Well, Congress, the CWU will not accept a Labour Party that allows the wealthiest to profit while claiming that there's no money for our public services. There is enough money to fund the NHS. There is enough money to rebuild our schools. It's just in the wrong place. The TUC and the trade union movement needs to remind the Labour Party where they come from. They're the party of the working people, and if they won't fight to get a better deal for us, we need to make them. The CW wholeheartedly supports this motion, creating a fairer society for all, finally, and ending the decades-long inequality that has brought us to the crisis we are in. Support a wealth tax and a fairer system of taxation. Please support this motion.
BCS.
Kevin McHugh, speaking on behalf of PCS in support of the composite. Congress, there's one phrase that's dominated above all others this week: Britain is broken. Broken in a very literal sense, with schools and hospitals falling to pieces and successive governments have cut corners and cut costs. And ordinary people are suffering. And the difference between those at the top and those at the bottom is more like a wealth chasm than a wealth gap. Those at the top continue to hold more wealth, siphon it away, offshore, starve public services of cash, and it's ordinary people who pay the price. Ordinary people do what's asked of them. They play by the rules, they pay their taxes, and the answer, one simple, is the game is rigged. I work for HMRC. We've got the situation where we haven't got enough staff to actually collect the tax that we need. And then customer services in HMRC, they're planning over the next period to cut 4,000 jobs. We don't want cuts of jobs, we want more jobs so we can go after the tax and actually make them pay what they have to pay. But Rachel Reeves has been mentioned, has ruled out a wealth tax. I think that's a staggering omission and would lay bare a lack of ambition and hope for a better future. Lucy Powell, Shadow Minister, said there's no money left. And the reality is there is. There's eye-watering amounts of money left. Company after company is posting profits. There's too much at stake to get this wrong. As I say, what we have to do is uncollected taxpayer debt in HMRC is at a historical level. The tax gap is not improving, it's getting worse. And during the pandemic, when we had all of the schemes that helped people out, fraudulent claims made on the pandemic will not be pursued or recovered. Each member of compliance in HMRC actually collects over £200,000 a year. and we're going to cut 4,000 of those staff. What we demand is more staff, a change in the actual HMRC rules to let us go after these people who are avoiding, evading and downright fiddling the taxes. And they're aided and abetted by this government, because some of the fiddling is actually legal. And even when it's not, we find, don't go after that, it's not enough. Yet people on benefit are getting pursued for very, very small amounts. We're actually not collecting millions and millions of pounds. If you give us the staff, give us the resources, we'll go after the gets and we'll get the money. But if they don't, then that's the fault of Labour. And I hope that Labour do change their mind on the wealth tax and that they actually introduce it. But give HMRC the resources and we'll get them. Thank you very much.
FDA.
Good afternoon, Congress. Tony Wallace, President of the FDA, Billy Bag fan and a taxman. Asking you to support Composite 6. Congress, tax, the level at which it's set, the basis in which it's assessed, whether that be earnings, profits, purchases, capital gains, distributions, interest, assets or wealth, and the sections of society who are asked to contribute, are all matters of political choice. Do you adopt a progressive approach based on earnings and an ability to pay? A regressive approach which places a greater proportionate burden on those at the bottom of society? Or, as the motion suggests, do you collect a greater share from unearned income, wealth and capital? The motion calls on the TUC to lead a debate on the reform of our tax system, and I welcome that. However, no matter how that review turns out, or which government leads us into the next election, the UK's choices when it comes to taxation will only be delivered by investment in a modern and effective tax administration and the people who work within it. I've spent my entire 40-year career administering and collecting tax, along with 64,000 colleagues, including the colleague from PCS before, with whom I share that load. And make no mistake, we are not the tea-swilling, lazy, feckless, ineffectual, stay-at-home caricatures portrayed by Guido Fawkes, Harry Cole, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Taxpayers Alliance, the Daily Mail and others trumpeting the anti-public sector bile put out by that frankly partisan mob in Tufton Street. We are hard-working, dedicated public servants delivering for this country every day. And my job for many years has been to challenge those people who would seek to break or bend the rules by avoiding and evading the obligations that the society has placed upon them. Congress, HMRC touches the lives of almost every person in the UK. 5 million businesses and over 34 million individuals. And the money we collect is spent on public services, including schools, the NHS, hospitals and the police. In the financial year 22-23, HMRC's expenditure of £6.9 billion enabled us to generate £814 billion for this country. And we paid out £33.9 billion to support our customers. Overall, it costs just half a penny to collect each pound of tax in the UK. And in December 2022, the National Audit Office recognised HMRC's compliance work as good value for money. We return on average £18 for every single pound that is spent on compliance. Why would you not invest in a return like that? Congress, support Composite 6, but only by investing in the people who actually deliver for you and for the country will you make the change you want. Thank you.
NEU. NEU.
President, Congress, Andy Bridges, NEU, first-time delegate. Before I jumped ship and became a lecturer a little under a year ago, I was employed by HM Revenue and Customs. Revenue and Customs was formed in 2005, on the 18th of April actually, when the Inland Revenue and Customs Excise merged. At that point in time, there were about 90,000 staff in the department. When I left last year, there were approximately 54,000 staff. A 40% reduction in staff over a 17-year period. I'm sure everyone here has a similar story. So where are these savings going? in tax breaks and handouts to Tory party donors and Tory chums. We heard Mark Sawatka talk about the 45 billion in uncollected tax on Sunday. And yesterday, the General Secretary, Paul, said we could beef up HMRC. I can't disagree with him. Next, I want to address the rat crisis in our schools. And in the spirit of solidarity, other public service buildings are available to be included in crisis. How are these repairs going to be funded? Now, we've heard how Britain is the 6th largest economy in the world on a system measured by gross domestic product. In 2022, it was worth £3.07 trillion. 3.07 trillion. And yet vast amounts of workers are feeling the pinch of the cost of living crisis, while CEO pay, company profits and shareholder dividends increase. So Rishi, Jeremy, et al., don't be telling me or telling us the money isn't there, it just needs to be taxed correctly. I'm sure we all remember the Panama Papers scandal when Dave Cameron was PM. It's never been addressed at governmental level. Tax loopholes could and should be closed. Finally, I want to address the Labour Party stance on future taxation. Apart from their pledge to review the non-dom status, which is expected to bring in £3.2 billion, which is a paltry figure when taken against the 60 billion underfunding shortfall in public services. Whenever you do get a Labour MP in front of the media, the party line is, we aren't going to reveal our tax plans because we don't know what state the economy will be left in. In fact, I saw Angela Rayner say that this morning on BBC Breakfast. She was stood over there when she said it. So let me offer a prediction on the state of the economy in a year's time. It won't be much better than it is now, because the Tory party seem hell-bent on a scorched earth policy as doing as much fiscal damage as possible as they hurtle towards being wiped out in the next election. There has never been a better time for us as a trade union movement to be bending the shell likes of Sir Keir and Rachel Reeves. We must be pressing for a comprehensive, progressive package of tax measures on the underlying proviso that our members, the workers, are no longer targeted to keep bailing out the failed Tory ideology. Support the composite.
Congress, Composite 6 on tax raising measures and fair taxation is in front of you. Will all those in favour please show? Hands down. All those against? That is carried. Congress, I call Composite 7, which is about secure, affordable housing for all workers. The General Council support the Composite motion, which is going to be moved by NESUWT, seconded by Equity, supported by USDOR, and I'll be calling a couple of the people in the debate. So NESUWT. Oh, she's here. And then Equity to second, and USDOR.
Sorry. Rosemary Carabine, NASUWT, the Teachers Union. Move in, Composite 7. The housing crisis in the UK is having a profound impact on living standards and is exacerbating the recruitment and retention crisis in the public services, including schools, the NHS, and in social care. The shortage of affordable, high-quality housing is a pressing issue for all key workers, including teachers, and it is impacting adversely on the provision of public services across the board. Rapidly rising property prices, the rises in mortgage interest rates caused by the kamikaze budget last year and escalating rental costs have rendered housing unaffordable for many. This affordability gap forces educators to seek accommodation way outside the areas where they are needed, leading to teachers having to endure long commutes, resulting in increased stress, increased cost, and a higher likelihood of burnout. Here in Merseyside, Many teachers are deterred from pursuing their career due to the strain of housing costs. Like many other areas in the UK, Merseyside struggles to attract and retain teachers, leading to a shortage of educators, particularly in key subject areas. House prices in Liverpool increased by an average of 10% in 2022. The average semi-detached house was 250,000, in excess of 250,000, while the average public salary in the city is 27,384, resulting in the average family home being almost 10 times the average public sector salary. We need to ensure all key workers, including teachers and low-paid key workers, can access their work without prohibitive housing costs. Poor housing makes it harder to attain a decent education. Insecure housing, overcrowding, noise, and cold and damp all mitigate against high educational attainment. Decent housing must be a right. It's essential that we tackle and address this issue with a comprehensive and collaborative approach. There has simply been a failure of successive governments and administrations to address the shortage of affordable housing for working people and their families. All workers have a right to a safe and affordable house or housing. Governments must implement policies that encourage the construction of affordable housing that are specifically targeted towards education and other key workers. As a minimum, affordable housing for all key workers, including teachers, a huge increase in social house building, with local authorities to be able to raise finance to build again. Proper regulation on all private landlords and fairer tenancies in the public sector. The housing situation in the UK is now critical. Urgent transformational change is not just desirable, it's essential. Congress, I move, please vote for this vital composite.
Equity to second.
Hi Congress, thanks President. Sam Swan from Equity. Delighted to second the composite which looks to get the endorsement for Equity's Dignity in Digs campaign. So performers and stage managers on tour, touring around like various theatres, have historically stayed in digs. And digs are a kind of bizarre and sometimes charming quirk of the theatre. They're called digs, but actually they're just short-term accommodation when you're working away. In the past, that has meant staying in the spare room of an elderly person who is a friend of their local theatre, and they provide a bedroom for a relatively cheap price and maybe a bit of company. But since coronavirus, it's not been safe for vulnerable people to share digs. And as the tentacles of Thatcherite neoliberalism have spread themselves, the fewer decent cheap digs options there are. Standards have slipped, but prices have risen, which is a familiar story that we're hearing across the board. With terrible short-term accommodation, with mould, cold, and barely working facilities, often too far from workplaces to be safe for the travel back after shows late at night, which is particularly bad for our visibly LGBTQ members and our members of colour. This is why we are calling for dignity in digs. The campaign focuses on providing touring workers with accommodation that is safe, secure, clean, private, and close to the venues they work within. And of course, as the composite makes so clear, housing is one of the greatest issues that affects all workers. So according to a recent study, the average UK household spent 42% of income on rent. In London, that rises to 72%. That is nuts. That is a nuts system. And within Tory excuses for capitalism, they usually rest on arguments in favour of productivity. But the UK's genuinely nutty Thatcherite landlordist system, it's unfathomably unproductive. Landlordism produces nothing while leeching off the labour of others. After the Housing Act of 1980 enabled the selling off of local councils' housing stock at discounted rates, within 15 years, 2.1 million council-built homes were no longer owned by councils, laying the foundations for the Wild West private rental market we see today. How bitterly ironic that despite being in the mud, Thatcher still lives rent-free in our housing system. This has to be reversed. Hundreds of thousands of genuinely affordable homes need to be built in each year of the next decade. Council housing stock needs to get back to pre-1980 levels, and rents need to be capped. Housing is a basic need. Homelessness can be eradicated and standards can be raised. This is not some wild utopian dream, as the Tories would like us to think. And if their system cannot provide that basic need, it is their system that should go. Congress, comrades, please support this composite.
President, Congress, Jane Jones, Usdaw, supporting the motion on secure affordable housing for all workers. Congress, this country's housing system is in a state of disrepair. The appalling truth is that many workers have no prospect of finding an affordable, secure and good quality place to live. Instead, they face a market where the only certainty is ever-increasing costs. In the private rental sector, tenants are expected to jump through a dehumanising series of hoops, all to live in unaffordable, unsuitable and unsafe housing. Soaring rents are forcing key workers, including those in the private sector, such as shop workers and delivery drivers, out of the communities in which they actually work. And as it stands, the crisis will only deepen, with rising interest rates and demand outstripping supply year after year. And yet, much of the Tory solution, these so-called affordable homes, are nothing of the sort. 80% of an extraordinary and unaffordable rent is still an extraordinary and an unaffordable rent, especially if you're in low-paid and low or insecure work. And this is all entirely avoidable. The housing crisis is being driven by the Tory government's policy decisions. Report after report shows that the solution to the housing crisis is to build more homes for social rent. More homes on a scale which can only be delivered by central government. Congress, housing is simply too important to leave to the free market and hope for the best. It has far-reaching consequences to every aspect of workers' lives, from their health to their finances and their ability to work. We urgently need to move away from the broken status quo, where people are having to hand over a massive chunk of their wages each month to pay off their landlord's mortgage. The government must accept its responsibility to ensure workers have access to genuine affordable homes. The fact is, every real solution to the housing crisis involves building more high-quality, affordable social housing. Secure tenancies in a reasonably priced, quality-control home can provide the stability that workers need. Please support this composite.
I'm going to call Unison next, and then CW, FBU and RCM.
Thank you, President. Congress. John Gray from Unison, speaking in support of Composite 7. It highlights the profound impact of the housing crisis on all key workers across public and private sectors. Congress, my day job is as a housing officer in London for a large housing association. I work in a regional team providing housing services to over 23,000 homes and to many vulnerable residents spread across North London. In my own particular team, there's 9 of us who are all tenancy ASB specialists. But Congress, why is it that I'm the only member of my team who's able to live in London? Why is that? None of the others live in London, so they all have to undertake expensive and exhausting commutes before and after a demanding day's work. While inadequate pay is one reason, the main reason I can live in London is simply due to age. Despite my youthful looks, I was lucky enough to work in London at a time when a worker could buy a flat. I paid about 3 times my salary at that time. But due to house inflation vastly outstripping pay, there was no way that my colleagues on current wages could afford to buy the same flat in 2023. They would need a multiple of nearly 9 times their income to buy that very same flat. As a Unison NEC member for all our housing association and charity workers, I know this is not just a London thing. In all our regions and nations, the housing crisis is worsening and blighting the experience of citizens and key workers, especially the low paid. This composite recognises the devastating impact of the crisis on the provision of critical services across the board and how this is having a detrimental effect on recruitment and retention, especially in services such as health and social care. Unison evidence shows that rising rents, mortgage rates and transport costs are putting rocket boosters on the cost of living crisis. This is pushing people into financial hardship, poverty and homelessness, with many having to cut back on food and essentials. The churn of our members who are forced to leave high-cost housing areas is putting a strain on key workers, on production and on service delivery. The Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, has admitted that the government should build more homes of every type each year, especially social housing, but it's failing to build sufficient number of these homes which are so desperately needed. This is why we must step up the pressure on the government and all political parties to take action to resolve the housing crisis by committing to building homes. This will need money. This will need a subsidy. We've got to be honest about this. So,
Time, delegate, please.
Please support the motion or composite.
CW.
President, Congress, Jackie Morrie for the Communication Workers Union to support Composite 7. Congress, we've already heard how real-term pay cuts and the cost of living crisis has impacted all of our members. A shortfall of affordable housing adversely affects our disadvantaged communities most by excluding key workers in schools, the NHS and social care, as well as those who are in low-paid, insecure employment. In the 1960s, 3 million homes were built in England, but only 1.3 million have been built since 2010. Since 1991, there's been an annual average loss of 24,000 social homes, and more people and households have been pushed into private rental. For the year to March 2022, private renters spent a third of their income on rent, or 40% if you're unlucky enough to live in the capital. High rental costs and the spiralling cost of living makes it increasingly unlikely that a deposit can be saved, and the prospect of home ownership is increasingly unattainable for many. In not-so-Great Britain, in 2021, a senior care worker couldn't afford a mortgage in 98% of council areas, a postal worker in 96%, a nurse in 74%, and a secondary school teacher in 60%. In 2022, 23% of private rental properties failed to meet the decent home standard, compared to 10% of social rental and 13% of owner-occupied homes. Congress, having a decent home should be something available to all. Congress, this situation is unacceptable. Social housing and affordable housing should be a priority. Affordable housing should be accessible, and key workers in high-cost areas should not be excluded from access to suitable accommodation. Congress, please support.
FPU.
Good afternoon, President, Congress, Maria Buck, Fire Brigades Union. We welcome this composite on affordable housing, and I hope this Congress sends this message loud and clear. Every human being deserves a safe home. And Congress, we are still waiting 6 years on for justice for Grenfell, a disgrace. We will continue to demand justice. We stand with the victims, the bereaved and the wider Grenfell community and all our members. We are happy that the Labour Party has committed to do right by the survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire and give them the support they need and bring those culpable to justice. We need to keep up the pressure to ensure there is an end to the deregulation of building and fire safety to prevent a fire like Grenfell ever happening again, and to ensure there are mandatory building standards. But they need to go further. They need to commit to rental caps and mass council house building programmes. We can't afford to wait and tinker around the edges. We want safe, affordable, secure housing, and it shouldn't be a luxury. It's a human right. Firefighters, all workers, and this Congress demand it. We support.
Delegate from the Royal College of Midwives, you've been very patient.
President, Congress, Nicky Charleston from the RTM, pronouns she, her, and very nervous public speaker. Congress, I come to you today with a personal story. My third year as a student midwife, I was made, myself, my spouse and our 3 young children were made homeless 2 weeks before Christmas. We were unceremoniously evicted from our house by a bank because I had been paying my rent, but my unscrupulous landlord had not been paying her mortgage. The bank took no pity on us. We were left at the hands of the social housing system. We were put into a hotel room, a single hotel room for 5 people. We lived there for 12 days before being moved into temporary accommodation 2 days before Christmas. As a student midwife, I was on £600 a month in bursary because I'm lucky enough to live in Scotland. My colleagues down south do not have that luxury because the Tories took that away from it. But £600 isn't enough for a deposit or for rent. So we were still at the mercy of the social housing system. We were then, 2 days before Christmas, moved into wildly unsuitable temporary accommodation. We were put on a 4th floor when I had 2 young children, one of whom is 3 young children, but one of whom is profoundly disabled. We lived there for 3 months, and we only managed to qualify for social housing because we were poor, because my child was disabled, and because I was gobby enough to speak to my MSP and beg Hannah Bardell for help, which to her absolute, her and her team worked tirelessly to get us that house, and I'm forever grateful. Congress, I do not present this story for pity. I present this story because it's not unusual. It's not unheard of. The system of landlords is vastly unregulated. It's £12,000 fine to be an unregistered landlord. That landlord still is not paid that fine. I want to highlight the failings of the government to protect me and my family, to protect us from a system that is being abused for profit. It's not being abused to help, it's not there to help people, it is just sheer profiteering and greed. And it is a story that is going to continue to be repeated. Congress, it cannot continue. We need affordable housing, we need private landlords to be held to account, and we need to protect our key workers, because if I hadn't have gotten that house, I wouldn't have ever become a midwife. I ask you to support this motion.
Composite 7. Will all those in favour please show? Put your hands down. Will all those against? That is carried. Congress, we are now moving into a debate on COVID. Before we start this debate, we want to acknowledge and note that there will be many people in this hall who've been directly affected by the COVID pandemic. There will be many people who have lost loved ones, family and friends. There will be many colleagues and comrades who have worked through the most traumatic experiences. In this debate, many will be reliving some of those experiences. And if you feel upset by this debate, please do not feel you have to stay. And please, can everyone look out for their colleagues and comrades who may be affected. I call paragraph 2.11 and composite 11, the COVID-19 public inquiry. The General Council support the motion to be moved by unison, seconded by NASUWT and RCM and FBU, if you could come down.
Congress, President. Libby Nolan from Unison, moving the composite on the COVID-19 inquiry. Congress, as the text of the composite makes clear, the hearings as part of the COVID-19 public inquiry have already laid bare major government failings, and it only started in June. That's a couple of months to get to the conclusion already that the government has failed in their preparedness and response. This comes as no surprise to many of us in this hall and those who worked unprotected and exposed from the beginning of the pandemic on the front line. And as a nurse, I used bin bags to cover my uniform and a Tesco's carrier bag on my head to cover my hair, along with many others. We knew the government wasn't ready. This lack of PPE caused unnecessary exposure and a huge amount of fear. We thought we were going to die. We were told we may die. And as many shop floor union reps will tell you, they are still dealing with members whose lives have been changed due to long COVID. Not to forget the many who are still dealing with the bereavement and disabilities that COVID caused and continues to cause. And COVID hasn't gone away. As I stood on my ward last week, the masks are back on, and we are once more struggling with staff shortages due to sickness due to COVID. Patients are again becoming very sick due to COVID, and operations are once again cancelled due to COVID. As new strains continue to develop, this is now a common thing. And in the past fortnight, it's been announced that the vaccinations will be brought forward. And I know in my place in Swansea, it starts tomorrow. And testing, once again, will be scaled up. And Congress, the effects of COVID have left many deep scars. The UK had one of the worst death rates, reaching nearly 250,000 in the UK by August this year. And we continue to see approximately 30 deaths a week. I want to remind Congress that the UK was amongst the highest COVID-19 deaths in health workers in the world. This demonstrates to me the very poor response to the pandemic. Not only were we catching COVID, we were spreading it and placing our families and patients at risk. This is why it's so important that COVID-19 inquiry is a full, open public inquiry and that the stories of those affected are told. Congress, it's also essential that people are held to account, not just the government ministers that are in power at the time, but also those that failed our public services in the decade before. Because we know, in many ways, it took the pandemic to expose the true cost of austerity. Prior to the pandemic, austerity cuts were having a devastating effect on our services and on our communities. When COVID arrived, it became all too clear just how hollowed out public realms had become. In my hospital, we were already on our knees, and we are still on our knees. We failed, and many workers in the UK are left with guilt and PTSD. Remember, we had hospitals needing to cope with a huge influx of patients. But shortages of staff, equipment, drugs, even sheets and uniforms, and the biggest shortage of them all, personal protective equipment, PPE. And our social care systems that had been cut to the bone, but still was expected to care safely for those in need. Those sent out of hospital without testing. No safeguarding for those patients, no safeguarding for the residents in those care homes that they were sent to. And we asked the questions. Many of us in this room that worked in that area, we asked the questions, why weren't they being tested? And not to forget the public health, another area that's been repeatedly reorganised and subjected to major cuts prior to COVID, meaning that when the time came for the driving force of a credible test and trace system from day one, it wasn't possible. The austerity policy hindered our ability to fight this virus. And that's not all, Congress. The pandemic also shed a harsh light on the huge inequalities in our society. The Office of National Statistics tells us that black people suffered up to five times more risk of death. That and the shocking statistics of the 60% of those who died from COVID being disabled. So Congress, as the composite makes clear, it's right that TUC has been on the front foot, making the case to the inquiry and to the public that austerity has already damaged impact on our ability to plan and respond. It is essential that the TUC and individual unions continue to play our part in that inquiry. Many of our members, dead and alive, rely on it. We must make sure that individual experiences, the stories are told, that the truth comes to light. And please, while I'm on this, can you visit the COVID-19 inquiry stall out in the arena there and tell your stories? Please tell your stories and help identify those responsible for the failures and ensure that they are held to account. Congress, it's also right that we pay our proper respects to all those who have lost their lives due to COVID, and that we stand alongside those that have lost loved ones or who are struggling with life-changing effects of long COVID. We know the right lessons have to be learned so that if and when we are faced with another pandemic, the same mistakes are not allowed to happen again. Let's remember, always remember the dead and fight for the living. Thank you, Congress. I move.
NASWT.
President, Congress, Jane Peckham, NASUWT, the Teachers' Union, seconding motion 30, with thanks to Unison for bringing this to the agenda at conference this year. Congress, this motion is of huge importance now that the public inquiry into the UK's government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has begun, and we are all involved in supporting the TUC as a core participant to collate the vital evidence needed to truly reflect the experiences of our members. The pandemic has exposed the long-term failure to address deep-seated inequalities in our society, which resulted in the disparate experiences of workers across all sectors, impacting most heavily on those with a disability, but also negatively in relation to race, gender, geographical location, and socioeconomic status. NASUWT believes that as we continue to highlight the equalities impact of the pandemic to the inquiry, we have to include the disproportionate impact of long COVID, especially at the intersection of protected characteristics for workers. Contrary to what you've just heard from the sister, this pandemic is classified as being over. But long COVID sufferers are living with its effects every day, and their plight must be recognised and addressed. Teachers are amongst the group of workers most likely to be affected by long COVID. The varying impact of long COVID has been recorded by scientists around the world. The Swedish Karolinska Institute, leads a global consortium on long COVID and has revealed and reported that the proportion of female long COVID patients outstrips men with long COVID by up to 70 to 80%. As a union operating in the sector with predominantly female workforce, this is clearly of concern. Through our long COVID campaign, NASUWT has been pressing for the condition to be classed as a disability, Whilst many employers have taken this approach, others have not, which has led to workers not receiving the support they should and being treated unfairly. We're also campaigning for reasonable adjustments, flexible working and financial compensation for teachers left unable to teach as a result of contracting COVID at work. Most recently, in supporting our members with submitting their testimony to the COVID inquiry, we received many personal statements from members who have suffered and are still suffering from long COVID symptoms. Many are struggling financially, as well as physically and emotionally. Consigning the pandemic to history risks leaving those whose health has been significantly and in some cases permanently affected by COVID-19 without the treatment and help they need. Congress, the legacy of long COVID must not be ignored. Please support this motion.
As a delegate from the Royal College of Midwives is coming up, can I notify the CSP, Prospect, PCS, NEU, UCU and Unite? You can all speak in the debate if you want to come forward.
Good afternoon, President. Good afternoon, Congress. I was going to tell you lots of what's been said beforehand, but I'm not. I'm going to take my paperwork and I'm going to put it to the side. What I am going to tell you, this is my second visit to a conference, first speaking under the TUC, and I'm like a rabbit in headlights, so I apologise. But I have been asked to talk on a subject that's really close to my heart. As I have long COVID. I had COVID pneumonia over 2 years ago. I was hospitalised for several weeks. I was going through the oxygen mask, the Ventura mask, knowing that a little bit more and I was going to be intubated. Luckily, I wasn't. But it took a hell of a lot out of me. I'd walk to the toilet, but I'd have to carry a canister of oxygen to walk from here to the gentleman in the front on 15 litres of oxygen. I couldn't walk that far. When I finally managed to get out, my husband took about 20 minutes to take me into the house. Excuse me, it's a bit emotional for me. Still gets me. Right. It took him my apologies, Congress. It took him over half an hour to get me up a set of stairs. He brought up a stool with me as I walked up a couple of stairs and had to stop. I was up in my bedroom for 2 weeks, and I was told when I left hospital I would be phoned to be offered oxygen. I'm still waiting for the phone call. I was in a wheelchair for at least 6 months afterwards, and when I did actually manage to walk and we went round Tesco's, I would get the first 2 aisles and I would have to rest. And by the time of end of it, I was pushing the trolley, not so I was pushing the trolley, I was pushing the trolley so I could lean on it. I had 18 months that I didn't return to work. At 18 months, I managed to go back to work. I was well enough to go back to work. I'm not recovered. I still drop my SATs. By the end of the day, my SATs are down to my boots. So I'd still suffer, and this is 2.5 years later. So COVID hasn't gone away. COVID still is here. I'm working staff with COVID. So please, please, please support this motion. I could tell you that 57% of midwives and support workers, 64% of midwifery educators, 97% of midwifery students felt that the pandemic had a negative impact on their mental health. as you see me standing here, you can see that it does exactly to that. So please, Congress, please support this motion.
FBU.
President, Congress, Sir Murray Fire Brigade Union, speaking in support of Composite Motion 11, and I'd like to thank all of the unions involved in bringing this Composite Motion to Congress, and to put on record the thanks to the TUC and the other affiliated unions for the work they've done so far in the public inquiry. The FBU, we wanted to add our solidarity on the issues raised and add some experiences of firefighters faced during that time. The motion is absolutely right to criticise the serious failings of the Westminster government and their lack of preparedness for the pandemic. Since 2008, they've published a National Risk Register, highlighting the range of risks we face across the UK. And from the beginning, this National Register warned about pandemics. They knew in advance about the experiences of avian flu, swine flu, SARS, MERS, and other earlier pandemics. Many public services took part in pandemic planning, and this was a decade before the COVID-19 outbreak. However, in the Fire and Rescue Service, this almost entirely ground to a halt after the coalition was formed in 2010, as I'm sure it did in many other sectors. So instead of preparing for emergencies that they'd identified on the National Risk Register, they imposed austerity, pushed on with privatisation, deregulation and contracting out. They fragmented and damaged public services, including the Fire and Rescue Service. This left us underprepared when COVID-19 emerged in 2020. In the fire service, ministers and chief fire officers were asleep at the wheel when the pandemic struck. They told us they'd assessed the risks. They told us that everything was covered, they were prepared, but in the first few months of COVID, the pandemic, it was clear that this was certainly not the case. The public inquiry has now begun to document and record the failures, including the failures of ministers, some of which are still in government, some of which are still in Parliament. And they should be held to account, and the most is right to point the finger at the people at the top. On Congress, I'd like to just say a few words on the role of trade unions that we played in the pandemic. As we've heard, and as we know, too many of our loved ones' lives were lost. But many more would have died had the unions and our members not done their work. Whilst ministers made a mess of it, the unions stepped in and stepped up to protect the wider public, but importantly to protect our members, so that they could continue doing the job, so that they could continue saving lives, so that they could keep the essential services that were needed across the country running. And trying to ensure that whilst carrying out this vital work, they didn't lose a life during the pandemic, and sadly, Congress, some of our members did pay that ultimate price. And to finish, during the pandemic, the FBU, we negotiated some bespoke national collective agreements with our employers and the chief fire officers. These agreements paved the way for firefighters to provide assistance to the NHS and other public services. Firefighters, they drove ambulances, they assisted in the temporary morgues that were set up, they delivered essential medicines, a whole range of activities. In Congress, the Fire Brigade Union will never forget or forgive the National Fire Service Chiefs Council and the National Service employers who pulled the plug on these national agreements mid-pandemic, at the height of one of the spikes. And they did that for political reasons, and also the fact that we were unwilling to compromise our members' safety regarding PPE or lessen the protection measures that were in place in these existing agreements, because our colleagues in the NHS was telling us they was absolutely necessary to keep our members safe so they could carry on doing that work. Congress, this government and future governments need to wake up and prepare for future pandemics, because without a shadow of doubt, they will come. Congress, support the motion. Thank you.
A delegate from the Chartered Society of Physiotherapists.
President, Congress, Michael Mander, Chartered Society of Physiotherapy, supporting Composite 11. It is vital that, when examining the UK's pandemic response, the independent COVID-19 inquiry considers the contribution of our trade unions and the workers who guided the nation through the pandemic. We know of members forced to work wearing bin bags to deliver care, who were asked to repeatedly use single-use items, who were provided equipment with no regard for fit testing. We know of vulnerable members who were let down with inadequate or zero risk assessments, or were forced to fight tooth and nail for the support that was owed. An example in our own trust is when, were it not for the intervention of trade union support, we were minutes away from senior management withdrawing all PPE use from all staff with immediate effect. It also led to the setting up of PPE working groups with trade union representation at all levels to ensure our staff were protected. These are the stories that need to be heard in the independent inquiry. Throughout, the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy supported members working across healthcare. From independent sector practitioners who saw their incomes disappear overnight, to NHS physiotherapists whose efforts and dedication undoubtedly saved lives. And this dedication to the NHS is why I am proud to announce that 88% of our members voting in Northern Ireland, the lowest paid NHS workers in the UK, have voted today to go on strike in support of better pay for staff and better care for patients. Across the UK, we worked with employers' bodies and individual employers on workplace safety in relation to PPE and risk assessments for staff at increased risk from COVID. But it will also shock no one here to learn that these experiences were not spread equally among our members. It was our marginalised members, women, those with caring responsibilities, disabled members, and those with Black, Asian or minority ethnic identities who bore the brunt. These outcomes were not inevitable. They were the results of deliberate policy choices and willful blindness from those in positions of power. Nor did they come out of the blue. They were the result of a social safety net gutted by decades of austerity, decades of underinvestment in public services. And what was the government doing while these experiences were happening to our members? They were too busy handing out illegal contracts to companies with questionable links to their own friends. They were wasting billions of pounds of public money on PPE that was ultimately deemed unfit for use. This is why we continue to support the TUC's invaluable contributions to the independent COVID-19 inquiry. We must hold decision makers to account for their actions before and during the pandemic and insist these mistakes are never made again. Please support this composite.
Thank you, Delegate. Prospect.
President Congress, Jeff Fletcher on behalf of Prospect, speaking in support of Composite 11. Congress, I haven't got a personal story to tell, but I am aware that the legacy of COVID will remain with all of us for a very long time. But could we in the UK have been better prepared? And that's the question that the COVID-19 inquiry is asking. As somebody who has 23 years experience as a health and safety inspector, I know part of the answer. Because for years, Prospect has been warning of the folly of the cuts being imposed on the Health and Safety Executive, and we take no pleasure in having our concerns proved right. You'll have heard previously that since 2010, HSE's funding has fallen by 43%, and the inspector numbers have fallen to an all-time low. Fewer inspectors simply means fewer inspections and investigations, and that means fewer opportunities to keep workplaces safe through advice enforcement and sometimes the inevitable prosecution. These cuts have hit HSE and its staff with real terms pay cuts of between 20 and 25%, and HSE is in the middle of a staff retention crisis, particularly around scientists and inspectors. HSE's own figures lay bare the impact of what this is having on its ability to regulate workplaces. Under HSE's own enforcement policy, HSE must investigate the most serious of incidents that are reported to it. A few years ago, mandatory investigations that were cancelled because of insufficient resources were in single figures. Since then, that number has begun to rise and is now soaring at the number of several hundred serious incidents each year not investigated, and that means that justice is not delivered to victims, not because investigation wasn't necessary, but because there's simply not enough inspectors to carry it out. Such issues were highlighted during the pandemic, HSE simply did not have the capacity to effectively regulate workplaces to the extent required to keep workers safe from COVID infection in the workplace. Insufficient independence of HSE from government resulted, perversely, in HSE telling inspectors that they weren't allowed to wear RPE when visiting site and also sites with outbreaks because COSH did not apply. And that was just to fit in with the government's mantra of hands, face and space. It's critical that the COVID inquiry hears the full extent to which cuts to regulators like the HSE contributed to the country's ill-preparedness in the pandemic. Whoever is in government when the inquiry reports back must take the provision of sufficient resources to the HSE to properly regulate health and safety as an action. And this includes taking up the recently published Public Bodies Review of HSE, which recommended that HSE should become a non-ministerial department, a move Prospect believes would bolster HSE's independence. So, Congress, please support the motion and let's ensure the right lessons are learned across the board and that the important services and organisations that protect workers and the public that we all hold dear are appropriately funded in the form that we as a trade union movement would support. Please support.
PCS.
President, Congress, Carol Revel, PCS, supporting Composite Motion 11. The COVID-19 public inquiry revealed serious failings and highlighted the UK government's failure to address deep structural inequalities in society. COVID hit after years of austerity, which devastated the civil service. Over half the magistrates' courts were closed, prisons were overflowing, cuts that impacted the most vulnerable in society, and an ability to oversee health and safety compliance in the workplace. Office closures in HMRC and DWP impacted the services we delivered. PCS repeatedly warned the Cabinet Office that the systematic underfunding of vital services severely undermined the UK's preparedness for dealing with a pandemic. The government is supposed to have contingency plans for things like pandemics, but did nothing. The warnings from China and Italy were not heeded, which meant that by the time they decided to accept that COVID was real, it had already taken a hold in the UK, and we all suffered for their inaction. Many of our workplaces were not safe, we did not have adequate PPE, and most of the ventilation systems in our own buildings were not fit for purpose. In DWP, the Minister pushed for job centres to remain open as she claimed it was safe, whilst at the same time her website said she would not be holding constituency surgeries because it was unsafe. Workers' and claimants' lives didn't seem to matter, as neither of them felt safe travelling to these offices. Trade union reps throughout the civil service fought for safer workplaces while continuing to support the most vulnerable in society. It's important that we all share our experiences with every story matters, as it will be the workers' account of the time. We have to counter and expose the government's greed and corruption, giving contracts to their buddies, whilst the workers were trying to keep society safe. Too many of these greedy capitalists did not deliver what they were paid to do. They must be held to account. One Tory donor said he would make ventilators, but only if he could make them outside the UK, because he couldn't make enough profit within the UK. We definitely weren't all in it together. Lessons must be learned. It must not happen again. Support the motion.
NEU.
Elise Poulter, National Education Union, first-time speaker. Illusionists and crooks use the technique of creating a deflection so that the focus is shifted away from the real deception, the real crimes. Trade union siblings, we absolutely know that the clapping for the NHS and for public sector workers was the deflection to mask their many, many crimes. It is important that we all detail our experiences, for every story matters, and explain how the failings, the deceptions of the government to initially listen to the science, to waste millions of pounds on public money on paying their friends for useless PPE, to not provide safe working conditions for those continuing to work through the pandemic, are heard. As a teacher, I see the continuing effects of these failings every day. Some of the 12 and 13-year-olds that I teach are barely able to write. And this is not because teachers were not teaching, but because they were from the lowest socioeconomic strata who had not got either the technology, the nourishments, or the support to access the online learnings. On returning en masse to work, class sizes of 32 plus meant social distancing was impossible in many state schools, probably not in Eton. So many school buildings, of which we've heard lots, weren't built with ventilation that meant that teachers were safe, as many other public sector and working places were either. Teachers would not have contracted long COVID and the legacy of long COVID, which we are still living with, as we've heard, if we had been provided with smaller class sizes and with buildings that were fit for purpose. We're still dealing with pupils who have lost, I have 2 children actually in my classes who lost both parents during the COVID pandemic and the ongoing effects that that has for them. And basically we have heard from everybody else many of the issues, but I would urge you to support, as I'm sure you will, this composite motion, because we do need to tell our stories and we do need to get justice.
UCU.
President Congress, Pat Roche, UCU, first time speaker. And the reason that I'm speaking is because I need to tell the story about one of our FE members who died at work. And I need to tell you what our union and other unions in this room are doing about long COVID. And I need to tell you about the government's approach, which is like so many, disgraceful. While Donna was at work and she died, they were partying in the House of the Parliament, having a good time. Exactly. The government's policy regarding the pandemic is to pretend that we're getting back to normal. More than 3 years after the pandemic started, the government's holding the message that it's all over now, there's no problem, nothing to think about. Britain's COVID policy is essentially Richie Sunak watching the waves come in like King Canute and thinking, if I think they won't come in, they won't. And then finding out that actually the waves still don't come in, they do come in, despite his denial is not an effective long-term plan. And it's one this government uses again and again and again. Crumbling schools, denial, all of it. COVID still kills 1 person every 3 minutes. Every 3 minutes. And there are people in this hall that will be sad, angry, upset, distressed, ill because of this COVID that happened. It could have been so different. A government's first responsibility is to look after its people. Our member died at Burnley College. They had a damning health and safety report, the first college to actually be found to be breaking the health and safety at work law. We were fortunate. We had a wonderful regional official, Michelle Monaghan, who tried and tried and tried to get Burnley College to take its responsibilities seriously without any success. What also happened as well is that we were in the same storm, but in a different boat. Our fractional workers were more likely to die than anybody else, and FE and HE are full of casual workers. That's the new norm, working out of your car. But let's pay tribute to the collective working of our unions, including 8 unions in this room, who have done a protocol on long-term COVID for employers to sign. And let's pay tribute to our members in FE who are going to go on strike so that we don't have roulette policies, that we have a single policy that is obeyed by all the colleges and not just the ones who want to pick. So one college might do safety, the other one might not. Don't forget, the TUC is fully behind telling your story. Telling your story is really important, but we need to keep carrying on telling the story, because I'll tell you now, COVID is nowhere near finished. Absolutely not. And we're playing Russian roulette with disability if we don't accept that. Thank you, Congress.
And last but not least, Unite. Steve.
Thanks very much, President. Wow, what a powerful and emotional debate. I was sitting at the front there thinking how lucky I am. I only got asthma as a consequence of getting COVID during that early period. Steve Turner, Unite, speaking in support of Composite 11. Comrades, we welcome the Composite. Unite was one of those unions first off the block calling for a full and independent public inquiry, and we continue to provide evidence to assist the TUC in coordinated collective input. Like all of us here, we've lost members to COVID, disproportionately, of course, from our black and Asian and ethnic minority communities. And Congress, it's no surprise to us that after 13 years of austerity, cuts to public services, privatisation and deregulation, it was working class communities, the elderly, the vulnerable and the disabled, those already struggling with poor health, too often hungry, relying on food banks and living in housing that in too many cases should have been condemned long ago, that bore the brunt of the pandemic. Conference, we've also highlighted that in many sectors with the highest numbers of deaths, they have an history of working both long and unsocial hours. And we've asked that the inquiry investigate whether this made workers more susceptible to the disease. So we welcome the call to highlight the equalities impact of the pandemic in the motion. Congress, the motion calls for decision makers to be held to account. And while we can stand proud of our collective role in protecting millions with furlough, our members who return to work to manufacture the PPE and the medical ventilators desperately needed on the front line, our health and care workers who put their lives on the line and too often lost them to save ours, those government ministers who failed to prepare went on to fail us at every level and every opportunity, passing VIP lane contracts to mates who went on to bill us for millions from the bar or the pub that they ran. Congress, while they were pissing it up in Downing Street, across the river at St Thomas's, loved ones were gasping for their last breath. And so we say, let there be no hiding place, no escape routes, or collective failure excuses. We demand that those responsible for gross negligence, corruption, and a wider dereliction of public duty are identified, prosecuted, and locked up. Lock the bastards up, Congress. Let's lock them up and deny them their freedom, just as they denied some 229,000 victims their health and a fruitful life. And finally, Congress, we pay tribute to the work and the determination of Lynn and the whole team at that COVID bereaved families group to seek justice. Seek justice for the victims, and we stand here in absolute and complete solidarity with them. So support Composite 11, Conference.
Congress, Composite 11 is in front of you. Will all those in favour please show? Hands down. All those against? That is carried. Congress, it's my privilege to introduce our guest speaker from the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, Lynn Sudbury-Riley. Lynn is one of the hundreds of thousands of people who lost a loved one to COVID-19 and alongside thousands of others in the COVID-19 bereaved Families for Justice, someone who has turned their grief and anger into action, demanding and campaigning to secure the public inquiry that will scrutinise the failings and the consequences of the last 13 years of our austerity Conservative government. Lynn, you're very welcome to this Congress.
Thank you. It is a real privilege to speak with you all today, so thank you again for inviting me. As a professor of the University of Liverpool, I'm a member of the UCU and involved in the ongoing industrial action, but as you know, I'm proud to be here today representing the COVID-19 bereaved Families for Justice and to talk about the importance of the public inquiry. The inquiry is so personally important to me due to the way my lovely dad died in March 2020. He'd gone into the Royal Liverpool Hospital for a foot operation. He had some post-surgery complications, so they had to keep him in. And during this time, we were watching the news, listening to doctors in other countries, especially Italy, telling us what was going to happen. But of course, not everybody would listen. On the 11th of March, the Champions League match between Liverpool and Atletico Madrid was allowed to go on, even though the Madrid fans would not have been allowed to go to such an event in their own country. The results were catastrophic and COVID ripped through this city. And yet, on the 19th of March, our then Prime Minister announced the UK is going to turn the tide on coronavirus in 12 weeks. Completely delusional. So we as a family stopped visiting our dad. We didn't want to risk taking the virus into him, but it was too late. And when lockdown eventually came, they discovered my dad had COVID, caught in hospital despite our family's efforts. We then began begging to be allowed to go in and see him, but we were denied, and my dad died alone 2 days later. I knew that my dad's death was different, the denial of normal grieving and mourning rituals, coupled with the way he died. We knew we should have been locked down earlier, felt incredibly wrong. And when I discovered the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group, I realised I wasn't the only one who felt betrayed by the system. As a professor, I research end-of-life care and bereavement services, so I felt compelled to do a piece of robust research with bereaved families. In all my years of interviewing hundreds of bereaved people, I have never come across grief as acute as this. Total sequestration, that's the legal banishment from our families, emerged as one of the most distressing elements in people's stories. And that wasn't just when people got sick or when they were locked away in care homes or hospitals. It carried on when they were dying, and even then it didn't stop. We weren't allowed to go to chapels of rest. We weren't allowed to have proper funerals or wakes or access the social contact that is so important when we are grieving. And that is why Partygate matters so much, to find out that that government were having jollies while our loved ones were dying alone is beyond obscene. We also need to change the rhetoric that was put out, the narrative that the people who died, oh, they were sick, oh, they were old, oh, they were weak. Many, many COVID deaths were preventable. These people were not collateral damage. Many of you worked through the pandemic, and some of you will have lost family and many will have lost colleagues. Perhaps they caught it as they were doing the job to keep the country going during lockdown. So this is why what happened must never be allowed to happen again, and we must learn those lessons and put effective plans into place to make sure that future pandemics won't repeat the problems of the past, and there will be others. Pandemics are increasing in frequency, SARS, MERS, Ebola, and then COVID. And these are the reasons why the current inquiry is so crucial to us all. And your movement was there with us. I'm glad the TUC and many other unions engaged with the bereaved families even before the inquiry. Many of you will know the 2021 International Workers' Memorial Day was marked with a contingent led by Paul Novak and Christina McInerney from Unison, And that took place at our beloved COVID-19 Memorial Wall. So it's good to know that we weren't alone, and we never have been, and your solidarity means everything. Bereaved families have expressed a real fear that the inquiry will not be fair. People drew analogies with Hillsborough and what went on there. But maybe there is hope. The inquiry pushed back against the Cabinet Office's attempt to obstruct it, and the Chair has promised that bereaved families will be central to that inquiry. We have had a few bumps in the road since, but we've got to keep going. The inquiry's listening exercise is now being rebranded as Every Story Matters, and it really does. These people were husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, friends, and dear colleagues. They were real and they mattered, and these stories need to be told. And so do the stories of working people, every one of them impacted by the pandemic. So please encourage your members to tell their stories to the listening exercise if we are ever going to get to the truth and learn lessons that we need in order to save lives in the future. It's vital that the voices of the bereaved and those with long COVID and working people are heard loud and clear. So, staying strong together is crucial to ensuring that this inquiry won't be sanitised. We hope it can get to the truth, learn lessons from that truth, and save lives for the future. But we must keep fighting to ensure that that happens. We must keep engaging with the inquiry to shape it and point out when it loses its way. And we must do this together along with the other core participants, because we're all fighting for the same thing, for truth and for justice. And we can only do this together with your solidarity. Thank you.
I think, Congress, you can agree that that was a powerful and moving speech from Lynn. Thank you, Lynn. Delegates, we return to section 4 of the General Council report, Winning a Better Future for Working People, on page 46. I will call Composite 20, Future of the BBC, and it's going to be moved by MU and seconded by NUJ. I have to take these two, don't I? Because they've all got an industrial thing.
Apologies about that, nearly didn't make it. Hi, I'm Naomi Pole, and I'm General Secretary of the Musicians Union. Thank you. I've actually been working in the union movement for a long time, but it's my first time speaking here, so. From Glastonbury coverage to the BBC proms, from Strictly to Jules Holland to Desert Island Discs, the BBC is synonymous with music. It's the biggest employer and engager of musicians in the UK. We've got 400 musicians in the BBC performing groups, 5 orchestras, and the fantastic BBC singers. We also have tens of thousands of contracts issued by the BBC to musicians every year, freelancers, including composers and performing musicians. The BBC is a daily part of most of our lives, and it plays a part in all musicians' careers. It's a really crucial training and development ground. When my nan was stuck in her flat during the pandemic, the BBC was her window onto the world, and it kept her company, TV and radio, all day and most of the night. There are 33 million listeners to BBC Radio live each week. 426 million people around the world access the BBC each week, so that's 6 times the UK population. And under Tory rule, the BBC licence fee has fallen behind inflation significantly. Massive cuts. This means lost jobs and lost services. Of course, it's always the local and the regional services that are the first to go. A vital window lost into local communities. In March this year, the BBC announced that they would be cutting 20% of jobs in our BBC orchestras in England, and also cutting the BBC singers altogether. Now, if you've not seen the BBC singers in action, I would encourage you to have a look at BBC iPlayer and look at the BBC last night of the proms, which happened at the weekend, and their fantastic performance. They're completely unique, and they're the UK's only full-time professional choir. So the backlash to the BBC's announcement was fantastic. We had so much support from across the music industry, from the wider public, from amateur choirs who made videos in support of the singers. And the BBC singers have now, we hope, got a secure future. Thank you. And thank you to all of our BBC stewards and the BBC singers stewards who've been working with us around the clock to try and save those jobs. The thing is that what I say again and again is the BBC is not the enemy here. The issue is the fact that the funding's been cut by the government so significantly, and they've got a difficult choice to make. The BBC is trying to make significant cuts in lots of areas, and at the end of the day, it impacts audiences and members of the British public. So what this motion calls for is support for the BBC, properly funded BBC with a secure future, offering secure jobs on decent paying conditions. I move this motion. Thank you.
National Union of Journalists to second, and do Equity and Prospect want to come down here?
Seamus Dooley, Assistant General Secretary of the NUJ, incongruously and improbably first-time Speaker at Congress. Probably a good place to start would be a musical note. Louis Armstrong famously declared, "If you have to ask what jazz is, you'll never know." The same delegate applies to public service broadcasting. The true value of public service broadcasting in the UK is best understood if you would close your eyes and imagine a British media landscape without the BBC, a landscape dominated by Murdoch and his cronies in a parallel universe where political analysis is dominated by the incisive commentary of the B-list cast of GB News. Think about that the next time you're going to tweet against the BBC. The current plight of the BBC is no accident, but is a direct result of a systematic attack on public service broadcasting by a parade of Tory Prime Ministers and Culture Secretaries intent on the destruction of public service broadcasting. The freezing of the licence fee for a decade was a deliberate and strategic undermining of public service broadcasting, an act of cultural vandalism. These attacks are as pernicious and as deliberate as the attacks on the NHS, on the attacks on public services. They are part of a pattern. Say what you will about the Tories, they're certainly consistent. George Bernard Shaw, an NUJ member, used to say that the definition of a cynic was someone who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Yes, this is a cynical government, but what's worse, they know the value and they don't care. Local radio is a window on the world for many listeners. And today the NUJ has called for an urgent equality impact assessment on those not just at risk for redundancy, but at minority and at disadvantaged groups, because we believe the BBC is in breach not just of its public service obligations, but on the Equality Act. I'm proud of our members who have been on strike and who have worked to rule in defence of public service broadcasting. Yes, the BBC is not perfect, but I do want to use this opportunity to call on trade unionists to remember that BBC workers are trade union members who have no responsibility for the current crisis. In criticising the BBC, and you will, and I do, be careful not to fall into the trap of strengthening the agenda of those who are intent on destroying public service broadcasters, those who sound eloquent in their criticism. But remember, there is nothing more eloquent than a vested interest disguised as a point of principle. And to those people, I say, go dance on someone else's grave. Save the BBC from itself and from this bloody government.
Equity.
Thank you. David John, Equity, speaking in support of the composite motion and to our amendment to the motion, which has been accepted. So thanks for that. President, Congress, we strongly support this. We just wanted to include audio performers. We at Equity are big supporters of the BBC, of course, but we don't always approve of the people who run it. We called for the resignation of the chair of the BBC and Tory donor Richard Sharp after the discovery of his cosy relationship with the Prime Minister at the time. Excuse me, I can't even say his name, who gave him his job. And of course, we were delighted when he finally went. Audio actors rarely get the opportunity to have a salaried job. We, alongside the MU, are the original gig economy, and we live a precarious and freelance life. We don't often get offered the rights that a salaried worker gets: holiday pay, pension contributions, and very importantly for us, residuals. You may have heard the result of the Musicians' Union survey today, saying half of their members earn less than £14,000 annually. Our own research with the University of Warwick, in our report recently, Not Here to Help, which shows the abject failure of the universal credit system for creative workers, discovered that the average in the cultural and creative industries is £15,270 before tax. So back to the BBC. BBC have a great tradition in radio drama. It's world renowned. Radio drama company is known as The Rep. It was formed in 1939 when it had 50 actors, more or less, and it basically invented radio drama. It's a brilliant thing to have invented. It's been copied throughout the world. By the 80s, however, it was down to 30 actors. By 1999, 15, and now it is down to 8. These were salaried jobs, good union agreements, with holiday pay, pension contributions, and residuals. The output of audio drama has shrunk drastically at the BBC. We've lost Friday drama, we've lost the weekend drama, we've lost the woman's hour drama slot, and the BBC singers and the orchestras, our comrades at the MU, of course, are now vulnerable to more cuts, these type of cuts. And they are nothing short of cultural vandalism. We just wanted to finally say that alongside the MU, we want the BBC to be properly funded, financed, nurtured, supported, the licence fee model to be protected so that we can retain at least some good union jobs as we can continue our struggle in our lives of precarity. And we want the BBC, I'll say it again, they are the envy of the world. We want them to continue with their mission to inform, educate, and entertain. Please support this composite. Thank you.
Thank you. Prospect.
President, Congress, Christine Daniel, Prospect Union, supporting the composite on the future of the BBC. The BBC is a national treasure, a public service broadcaster that is the envy of the world, bringing us independent, local, national and global news in an era of polarisation and disinformation, creating incredible, television drama that brings the family together on the sofa and putting British stories on screens around the world. Broadcasting moments of sporting triumph and gut-wrenching defeat that unite the nation. And as one of the biggest unions in the BBC, our BEC2 members are critical to all of this, working behind the scenes to bring you the content that you love. But this national treasure has come under sustained attack in recent years. Political decisions to freeze the licence fee have seen the BBC's real terms income fall dramatically, leading to job losses across the organisation and significant cuts to local services. Our talented members and those in our sister unions, the MU, NUJ, Equity and the Writers Guild, are suffering the brunt of these job cuts. These cuts are an act of cultural vandalism, and they are an intentional one, because they have been accompanied by relentless attacks on its independence from the government. Threats to abolish the licence fee funding model, accusations of political bias, and the appointment of a chair who failed to declare he'd secured a loan for the Prime Minister who gave him the job. The BBC won't always get it right. No organisation does, but it remains a shining beacon of broadcasting around the world, and it must be defended. That is why we've been running our hashtag A Licence to More campaign to celebrate the first 100 years of the BBC as the bedrock of British culture and ensure it plays a leading role in the next 100 years of our cultural lives. The licence fee model is critical to its success. Its opponents have completely failed to put forward an alternative that would enable the BBC to continue delivering its mission to inform, educate, and entertain us. And some politicians who have supported the licence fee freeze are now criticising the BBC for having to implement the very cuts they have caused. Their actions have consequences, and we must make this clear, as a formal review into the BBC's funding model is expected in the autumn. The BEC2 sector of Prospect will be fighting for the licence fee model and a sustainable funding settlement that keeps pace with inflation, enables long-term planning, and ensures the independence and world-leading status of the BBC is here to stay. Congress, please stand with us and support the composite.
Okay, Composite 20 is in front of you. To remind you, the General Council position is to support the Composite. All those in favour? Hands down. All those against? Okay, that is carried. Moving on to Composite 21, Solidarity with Ukraine. The General Council support the motion, and I will call on the General Secretary to explain the position on behalf of the General Council once it's been moved by GMB, seconded by ASLEF and supported by NUM. Other speakers in this debate will be PCS, Unite and Community. Barbara, go ahead.
President, Congress, Barbara Plant, GMB, proud to be moving this motion of solidarity with Ukraine. Firstly, I would like to thank ASLEF and NUM for being part of this composite and for their constructive approach in those discussions. Congress, life changed for millions of people on the 24th of February 2022. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was an appalling violation of international law that has left a trail of war crimes in its wake. The atrocities in Bucha and Izium shocked the world. More than 700,000 children have been deported from Ukraine to Russia, and trade union activists have disappeared in the occupied territories as Russian forces advanced. Congress, our policies, and the principles of our movement demand that we work to secure peace. And they also demand that we stand with the oppressed and the attacked in their hour of need. As internationalists, we should set out a strong collective response to the injustice and injury that is being inflicted upon the Ukrainian people. Congress, our solidarity must know no borders. For decades, the Putin and Lukashenko regimes have subverted and suppressed trade unions. The leadership of the Belarusian Congress of Democratic Trade Unions were imprisoned earlier this year. Just last week, the Russian state declared the International Transport Workers' Federation to be an undesirable organisation, with potentially severe consequences for the workers covered by the ITF's agreements. And free trade unions are suppressed in the occupied regions of Ukraine. Congress, we demand the release of all trade union prisoners, and we stand with all free trade unionists in their struggle to protect and advance workers' rights. We also cannot ignore failings at home. For too long, oligarchs' money has been spent unhindered in the UK, in the City of London and in our politics. And our own government shamefully advised on how workers' rights could be weakened in Ukraine. That's why the motion calls for the full restoration of workers' rights in Ukraine, which are restricted by the Ukrainian government under martial law. This must be accompanied by a reconstruction programme that rejects privatisation and deregulation. For Ukrainian workers, justice must follow the suffering of war. And the motion echoes the United Nations call for the withdrawal of Russian forces from all illegally occupied territories. In bringing this motion, we listened carefully to the Ukrainian unions. They are struggling to support their members, many of whom are critical health and infrastructure workers who are targeted during Russian attacks. Many trade union members are now here in the UK. They need our support. And many trade union members are now serving on the front lines. That is why we are calling for aid. Our Ukrainian union siblings did not choose conflict. They want peace. But Putin intends to extinguish democracy and fundamental labour rights. He denies even the idea of a separate and free Ukrainian nation. They are fighting for their survival. As Alexandra Matvichik, the Ukrainian Nobel laureate, said, peace cannot be reached by a country under attack laying down its arms. That would not be peace, but occupation. One of the inspiring trade unionists I've met is Ivana Krabko. She is the chair of the Youth Council of the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine. Earlier this week, in a message to TUC delegates, she asked, how can we negotiate with someone who just wants to kill us, to destroy us as a nation? Of course we want peace, more than anything, but we want a just peace without occupiers in our country. Congress, we want peace, and there will be no just or enduring peace if Ukraine is forced to a settlement on Putin's terms. The motion in front of you is a serious and practical statement of solidarity. I am proud that it's supported by Ukrainian trade unionists. 85 years ago, this conference sent a message to the Spanish people of a further practical expression of sympathy, hope and encouragement in the dark hour of their struggle to carry on until their fight for democracy and liberty has been overwhelmingly won. Let us send a message in that same spirit today. Stand with Ukraine, stay with Ukraine, and solidarity. Solidarity with our Ukrainian trade union sisters and brothers, solidarity in their struggle for freedom, and solidarity until that day of peace when all workers are free. Please support.
to session. Second.
Thank you, Conference. Simon Weller, Assistant General Secretary, ASLEF. To be honest, I don't think I could add any more to those powerful words from Barbara. But I would just want to reinforce 2 points that she made. One is that the Labour reform legislation that predates the invasion, the briefing documents that we have copies of, bear the logo of the British Embassy in Kiev. Let it be no surprise that the neoliberal British government has been advising the neoliberal government in Ukraine on Labour reform, and we all know what reform means. So the trade unions in Ukraine need our solidarity. They are facing the same issues that we face in terms of the attacks by the neoliberals. But let's make one thing very clear. Trade unions are not banned in Ukraine. Many, many trade unionists are fighting on the front lines. And those trade unions, the FPU and the KVPU, are supporting their members through really difficult times. But what Barbara did say is the International Transport Workers Federation, which represents transport workers, and many of the transport unions in this room are affiliated to it, they have been banned by the Putin government, which is going to affect a lot of seafarers. The ITF had been backing both seafarers from the Russian nation and the Ukrainian nation. They did not discriminate on grounds of religion or race or nationality or what their government was. They were there to support trade unionists in the way that we all do. And I think that is the message that I'm going to take from that, is we have relationships with the Ukrainian rail unions. We have relationships with the Ukrainian trade union centres. And we have listened to what they want. And that is our solidarity and our practical assistance. Thank you, Congress.
As Chris from NUM is coming up to support and make it clear, also calling an additional speaker in this debate, which is the FBU.
President, Congress, Chris Kitchen, General Secretary, National Union of Mine Workers, speaking in support of Composite 21. Delegates, I've been surprised by the amount of misinterpretation placed on this composite. It is not the intention of this composite to prolong the war in Ukraine. We all wish to see an end to the war as soon as possible, but it has to be an end on the terms that the Ukrainian people accept. It should be their choice what happens in their country. The last delegation I went on to the Ukraine was in February 22 to Kyiv, returning the day before the illegal invasion by Russia. When speaking to workers, trade unionists and local officials, I expected the massing Russian forces on the Ukrainian borders to be their main concern. It wasn't. Their main concerns were the same as ours: defending terms, conditions and wages, defending against privatisation and the casualisation of work, a COVID recovery that was to be paid for by the workers. Speaking to the miners' union officials, they informed me that they're mainly organised in the Donbass region mines, and he had very few members still working in the mines, something the NUM can relate to. The reason for that was since the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia has been supporting and supplying weapons to keep a conflict in the east of the Donbass going, which had resulted in most of the mines being too dangerous to work. Most of his members that found other jobs were unemployed or had taken up arms to defend their homes. Thousands have lost their lives in this conflict before the latest illegal invasion by Russia. Workers and trade unionists in the Ukraine are asking for our support. Congress, please support the composite.
Thanks, Chris. I now bring in the General Secretary to explain the position on behalf of the General Council.
Thank you, President. Congress, the General Council supports the motion with this explanation. The motion condemns Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and its terrible consequences for the Ukrainian people. It rightly offers strong support for Ukrainian workers, their unions and Ukrainian refugees in the UK. In condemning the actions of the Russian government in Ukraine, the reference to war crimes is phrased as the Russian programme of ethnic cleansing. This term has contested definitions. However, a warrant for the arrest of President Putin by the International Criminal Court notes that there are reasonable grounds to believe that he bears responsibility for the war crime of unlawful deportation of population and that of unlawful transfer of population from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation in prejudice of Ukrainian children. The motion calls for the withdrawal of all Russian forces from the territories occupied since 2014. That is, the internationally recognised borders of Ukraine. That's in line with demands of international law and the UN General Assembly call in February that Russia should immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders. But it should not be read as a precondition for negotiations aimed at concluding a just peace, which must be a priority. And with that explanation, Congress, we ask you to support.
Congress, I'm going to be calling Unite, FBU, PCS and Community to speak in this debate. So Unite.
Thank you very much, President. Gail Cartmel, speaking in support of Composite 21 for Unite. Our union has had many thoughtful and lengthy debates about the dreadful conflict in Ukraine. In March 2022, we debated for hours, and our branches across the United Kingdom responded most generously to the humanitarian appeal. We debated again at our policy conference in 2023 and reiterated our stance. And so therefore we do unreservedly condemn Putin's invasion of Ukraine and stand in full solidarity with the millions who are victims of that attack. And it was reported in July. The UN General Secretary's report on children in armed conflict names Russia among the worst violators of rights. So we heard that among the growing civilian death toll in July were 550 children, 550 futures never realised. And UNICEF reported in August that nearly 1,000 children have now either been killed or seriously injured. This carnage is a humanitarian disaster, which is why Unite reiterates its calls for an immediate ceasefire and a withdrawal of all Russian forces from Ukraine. And in line with the oldest traditions of international trade union movement, Unite believes wars are never in the interests of working people. The motion refers to the Spanish Civil War. We're not convinced of this comparison. However, we know it is always working people and their families who pay the highest price and suffer most when conflicts erupt that are led by elites with fully different interests to their own. And it's important to say, Unite has stood for peace throughout the history of our union, but we are not pacifists. The defence of internationally recognised borders is and must always be a just cause. Unite rejects any and all attempts by the UK government to use this conflict as a cover for its own failings or indeed as an excuse to introduce unpopular and unacceptable policies. So we continue to stand in solidarity with the people and unions of Ukraine. We reiterate our call for all efforts to be exerted to achieve peace based on common security, justice, and for the full respect of human rights and international law, and for negotiations to be supported by governments at the highest of levels. So finally, let us agree, Congress, to seek to strengthen links with Ukrainian trade unions and support their rights to organise freely, and especially recognise their role in building a more just and democratic post-war reconstruction. And Congress, I'm sure you will support this composite, and I'm sure you will send your solidarity and your heartfelt condolences to the families torn apart and terrorised by this war. Thank you, Congress.
FBU.
President, Congress, Jamie Newell, Fire Brigades Union. The invasion by Russia was a crime pursued for the narrow interest of the Putin regime, and we condemn it. We speak as the union which brought the first ever motion to Congress on Palestinian rights, the first union to affiliate to the anti-apartheid movement, and a founding union of Justice for Colombia. Now, there's been some powerful words in the debate so far, but let's not distract ourselves from the original motion and the undertones of this composite, which is one of UK military intervention. We are proud of our history of internationalism, and we oppose this composite. The space for workers to debate this is being shut down, and I'm proud that our union creates a space to discuss the context of the war, the role of NATO, and who is dying in this war. Whilst we support elements of the composite, indeed, FBU members have delivered practical aid via convoy, supporting those suffering in this conflict. But we do not believe that the escalation of war offers anything to the working class in Russia or Ukraine. Whilst the motion mentions opposition to imperialism and imperialist interests, they exist in both sides of this conflict. Anyone who reviews the military interventions of the past 20 years must recognise that. You only have to look at Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya. Those wars have turned their worlds into a never-ending spiral of conflict, destroying societies and victims later being blamed for becoming refugees. During this year's Congress, we've heard about the rise of the far right. These elements exist in both Russia and Ukraine. We oppose these groups, and we do not support arming them now, only for them to become a threat in the future, and yet the composite stays silent on this issue. This composite talks of the opposition to imperialism, so the first duty of any anti-imperialist is to oppose the imperialism of your own government. That does not mean endorsing NATO, the escalation of war with NATO weapons, NATO funds or NATO advisors. This composite will only serve to line us up with the Tory government, who is waging class warfare against our people at home, as we've been discussing this week. We do not trust the government at home, and we do not trust them abroad. Now, I'm surprised again at the General Council for opening Congress with a commitment to world peace, and then supporting a composite that ultimately is predicated on expanding UK military efforts and the proliferation of UK arms, which will only lead to the deaths of civilians for the next 20 years, the largest victims now and in every war since World War II. Common interests of Ukrainian and Russian people are not served by our country providing military and practical aid. Now, as a son of a paratrooper, I would say this again. Remember the 179 and the 454, the number of the UK military personnel lost in Afghanistan and Iraq. Remember that a bayonet is a weapon with a worker at both ends. Remember that there are no lasting peace through superior firepower. Congress, we cannot simply support a motion that is predicated on the expansion of UK arms sales. And if your union does oppose this composite, then sit up straight and put your hand up high. Remember the millions of nameless victims of past imperialist endeavours, the 179 and the 454. Only the dead have seen the end of war, but it doesn't have to be that way, and another world is possible. Congress, I implore you to oppose Composite 21.
PCS.
President, Congress, Mark Sawatko, General Secretary of PCS. and last-time delegate. It'll be the last time I'll be addressing the TUC conference. And can I say that I couldn't be prouder that the last speech that I will make will be called for unequivocal support and solidarity for the people of Ukraine, the trade unions of Ukraine, and those people who are currently suffering occupation, oppression, brutalization, mass murder, targeting of their infrastructure in a brutal Russian invasion. Congress, if our movement stands for anything, we stand for international solidarity, and that means we must stand with the people and unions of Ukraine. We are not the government. We are an independent British labour and trade union movement, and it is therefore essential that we send our unequivocal support to those people who are watching. And Congress, we heard earlier of the mention of Ivana, someone who has addressed my own union's executive on a number of occasions, an incredibly brave woman who addressed our Congress when bombs were raining down in Kiev and sirens were going on in the background. Therefore, not a single delegate here should have any hesitation in calling unequivocally, without any conditions, for the Russian military aggression to stop, for the immediate removal of all Russian occupying forces from the land of Ukraine. And when we vote, conference, let's remember these people are watching. These people who have suffered indiscriminate bombings, mass graves, civilians being targeted and tortured, water and electricity supplies being bombed, a country sent into the freezing winter without the basics that we take for granted. Who could hesitate in condemning all of that? And whatever the interests of NATO and whatever the debate about the interests of Biden and Sunak, it is Russia that has invaded Ukraine. It is Russia that is murdering Ukrainian men, women, and children. And to do anything other than send our solidarity to them today, I think, would be a major mistake. And Congress, we have to say this. For those who argue this is a proxy war and it is competing imperialist powers, is the main issue, you make a very basic mistake. The main issue is the occupied people and trade unions of Ukraine, and we should stand with them first and foremost and not relegate them to the international games that people mention. However, Congress, I do want to say this. We do believe the composite is flawed. We do believe the reference to the Spanish Civil War is wrong, and we did have some reservations about the original motion. We think it is important to recognise that Biden and Sunak and the West do have interests that are not in the interests of Ukrainian workers. They will seek to profiteer. They will seek to open the country up to privatisation and make massive profits. They will seek to impose crippling debts on the people of Ukraine. So, Congress, I finish with this. Our independent labour movement message should be loud and clear. We are with the Ukrainian people. We are with the Ukrainian trade unions. We want Russia out. Only the people of Ukraine should decide what the settlement looks like, not Biden, not Putin, and not Rishi Sunak. We condemn the erosion of trade union rights in Ukraine, and we call for Western powers to write off all the debts accumulated by the Ukrainian people. And finally, let us say this, hopefully unanimously. When workers and when people are oppressed, when they are invaded and when they are brutalised, the British trade union movement stands with you. Support the composite.
Community.
Good afternoon, Congress. President Dean Cox Community Union's proud to support this composite. At the core of our movement has always been the guiding principle of international solidarity with our brothers and sisters across the world, to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in their struggle against tyranny and against oppression. When brave Republicans in the Spanish Civil War fought against the brutalizing force of fascism within their own country, we stood with them. When the Germans, fascists, marched across Europe, questioning the very existence of millions in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and even Russia, we stood in defiance, united with one voice. So I ask Congress, when once again we see the spectre of authoritarianism march across Europe, when we see our brothers and sisters in Ukraine brutalised, their lands taken, and the very idea of their existence as individual people questioned? Do we shy away from the mantle that has passed to us by other trade unionists of the past? Do we break our bonds of solidarity with those who ask merely for the affirmation of their right to exist? The answer to these questions must be a resounding and clear no. The Russian state under Putin is a force that oppresses its own people with the baton and now seeks to oppress Ukraine with the barrel of a gun. You do not compromise with a state like this. To hand Ukraine lands to Russia sends a message to dictators across the world that this is not morality, not solidarity, not compassion that makes the right, but the strength of your arm and your will to dominate. Congress, we cannot cast down the mantle that is passed to us. We cannot ignore the call for solidarity. We must support this motion and support our Ukrainian brothers and sisters in full liberation of their lands. To do anything less betrays their very foundations of the movement. Support the tradition and the transition into international solidarity. Support the Ukrainian people, and please support this motion. Thank you.
GMB, call GMB to exercise their right to reply.
President, Congress, Barbara Plant exercising the right of reply. Thank you to the delegates who have spoken in favour of the composite. And in reply to points made during this discussion on this important issue, we are not seeking to limit debate. We welcome it. We are only calling for the aid that our Ukrainian counterparts are requesting. And in reply to the delegate from the FPU who said that this motion is linked to arms sales, this objection is not based on the text of the motion. I understand the opposing point of view, but the alternative is to deny Ukraine the means of self-defence. Congress, we know how this policy ends. It was the policy that created the embargo on Spain in the 1930s, which doomed the Republic and condemned the Spanish people to 40 years of fascism. We must not repeat that mistake. And finally, Congress, before and during this debate, there has been online abuse against those unions that spoke in support of this motion. I am sure that all delegates would agree that this is unacceptable, and I would like to thank colleagues in the hall for a dignified debate. Congress, I ask you to send a strong statement of solidarity from this conference. Please support this motion. Thank you.
Okay. Congress, Composite 21, Solidarity with Ukraine, is in front of you. Will all those in favour please show? Put your hands down. All those against? That is clearly carried. Congress, we are a little bit behindhand still. What I intend to do is take Composite 22 as the last item of business. Unfortunately, won't be able to take, other than the mover and the seconder and the General Council explanation. I hope people will be okay about that. We really have not got a lot of time. So, I'll call paragraphs 4.9 to 4.14, Composite 22, the right to boycott. The General Council support the motion, and I will be bringing the General Secretary in to explain the position on behalf of the General Council, and apologies for delegates who are unable to be called in this debate, but to be moved by NEU, seconded by Unison.
Thank you. President, Congress, Louise Regan, National Education Union, moving Composite 22, the right to boycott. Congress, we have a very proud history in the trade union movement of standing in solidarity with the Palestinians. Today, Palestinians need that solidarity more than ever. After the election of Israel's most extreme, far-right, ethno-nationalist government in its history, we have seen this government ramp up its system of oppression, which a consensus of the respected international human rights community now recognises as meeting the definition of apartheid. It is a government that has embarked on the annexation of the West Bank, accelerated colonisation of Palestinian land, the destruction of Palestinian homes and schools. A government that is encouraging and supporting armed settlers to conduct pogroms of Palestinian villages. 17 villages attacked by settlers in 1 week alone earlier this year, with homes set ablaze. Our government, instead of confronting this reality, continues to treat Israel as a democratic ally. Instead of subjecting it to sanctions, as it did to Russia, it launches a roadmap that promises an extension of free trade, removes any principle of excluding settlements, and contains not a single mention of the word occupation or apartheid. Rather than taking action, as it has with Ukraine, to encourage public bodies to introduce their own divestments and boycotts, it instead plans to introduce an anti-boycott law specifically designed to prevent public bodies from divesting in companies complicit in supporting Israel's violations of international law. If passed, this bill would undermine ethical investment and procurement by public bodies, by restricting the consideration of human and workers' rights, international law, and environmental concerns linked to the behaviour of a foreign state. It would disrupt a whole range of legitimate campaigns for social and climate justice. That is why a coalition of more than 70 civil society groups have joined PSC to oppose the bill. Although the bill affects core freedom, the government has made clear that the main target is the Palestinian boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. Congress, this bill uniquely seeks to deprive the Palestinian people the right to call for the non-violent tactic of boycott and divestment to end their oppression. Importantly, this motion calls for not only opposition to the anti-boycott bill, but rejection of any attempt to delegitimise the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions, or to suggest that Palestinians should be denied the right to appeal to people of conscience for support. Finally, Congress, we must make clear to the Labour Party that in opposing the bill at its third reading, they must oppose the bill in its entirety, with no attempt to delegitimise the Palestinians' call for BDS. Congress, as I said at the start, we have a long and proud history of supporting the Palestinian people. But Congress, time is running out. As more and more Palestinian land is stolen, we have to act now. As Nelson Mandela said, we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. Congress, none of us are free until all of us are free. Please support the motion and continue to fight for justice and freedom for Palestine. I move.
Unison to second, please.
President, Congress, Liz Wheatley, Unison, seconding the composite and thanking the NEU for submitting the original motion. The Economic Activity in Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill is actually really outrageous. It's unreasonable, unnecessary and unwieldy, and it will result in a catalogue of consequences that are even longer than its title. It's yet another attempt by a Tory government to play political games with our pensions and our public services and, most importantly, with Palestinian lives, and we need to stop them. Each year, the UK spends about £38 billion procuring goods and services, and for a long time, we've been calling for public sector bodies to have ethical procurement and supply chains, including workers and human rights within those. This bill will stop us doing that. It will make it illegal for public bodies to take a political stand against the conduct of companies or states when procuring or investing. It won't just affect our work on Palestine, but all over the world, from the manufacture of solar panels using Uyghur forced labour in China, to the production of medical rubber gloves in Sri Lanka, to our work around the climate emergency. The Tories are trying to say that public bodies can only invest or act in line with their foreign policy. We cannot align our campaigning with the racism and bigotry of James Cleverly, of Suella Braverman or of Rishi Sunak. This would stop us campaigning for the local government pension scheme, which is our pension, it's our deferred wages. It would stop us from campaigning to divest from companies profiting from the illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, and companies that are therefore in breach of international law. And this bill would give a green light to the Israeli government to continue with its policies of apartheid and annexation. Our class has a proud tradition of fighting for justice, and that includes boycotts, from cotton to the buses in Montgomery to apartheid in South Africa. This bill would have prevented all of those campaigns that were part of changing the world. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of going to Palestine on a Unison delegation. Whilst there, we met ordinary Palestinians thrust into doing extraordinary things because of life in the occupied territories. They were trade unionists, factory workers, education workers, and they were campaigners against the detention of children. We visited Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights organisation that had just been proscribed by the Israeli government for being terrorists. Instead of telling us what they were doing, they asked what we were going to do about it, about the occupation and about the UK investing in and profiting from that occupation. BDS is central to our answer to Al-Haq and our answer to the Palestinians, and it's central to our fight for a better world. Support this composite and fight for the right to boycott.
Thanks, Liz. Bring in the General Secretary to give an explanation from the General Council.
Congress, the General Council supports the motion with an explanation. Congress, we stand united in condemning Israel's ongoing illegal occupation of Palestinian territory and in expressing our deep concern about the escalating violence in the West Bank. Congress, we also oppose the Government Economic Activities of Public Bodies Bill, which would breach fundamental rights of freedom of expression and speech and contradicts the UK's commitments on human rights, responsible business conduct and international law. This motion references the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. In supporting the motion, we reaffirm the policy adopted by Congress in 2021 to, and I quote, boycott the goods of companies who profit from illegal settlements, the occupation and the construction of the wall. And with that explanation, the General Council asks you to support the motion. Thank you, Congress.
Okay. So, Composite 22 is before you. Right to boycott. All those in favour, please show. Hands down. Those against? That is carried. Congress. Composite 10, unfortunately, has also fallen off the agenda. That will be rescheduled for tomorrow with some other outstanding business. Couple of things before we go. Couple of things important. First thing, there's been a request for LGBT delegates and visitors to come to the stage here immediately Congress finishes if you want to be part of a group photo. That's happening immediately Congress finishes, and also black delegates, black worker delegates and visitors who also, if they want to take part in a photo, to meet in the Congress Hall here 10 minutes before Congress starts tomorrow. Before we close, I want to announce the results of the General Council elections. Don't get too excited. There are no contested elections this year. All members of the General Council and the GPC are elected unopposed, and thanks to them for all their hard work. Okay. That concludes this afternoon's business. A reminder, there are various meetings taking place this evening. Some of the meetings are in the Congress Guide. For latest updates, check on the TUC website. Make the most of all that's available at this Congress. Have a nice evening and see you at 9:30 tomorrow.